Supper's ready. But nobody at that table knew it would be the last quiet meal before the sky came apart. Get inside. I don't give a damn what's stitched on your jacket. Get inside before that funnel tears every last one of you apart. Ellie Marsh wasn't asking. She was hauling a stranger, blood soaking through his sleeve, his boots dragging, toward the only door standing between 27 members of the Iron Sons Motorcycle Club and a tornado that was seconds away from wiping out the last thing she had in this world. 3 years a widow, one garage, one underground shelter her husband had built with his own 2 hands, and in the next 10 seconds, she was about to hand it over to the very people this whole town had spent years warning her to run from. Before we dive in, if stories like this one hit something in you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and stick with me to the very end. When you do, drop a comment and let me know which city you're tuning in from tonight. I read every single one, and honestly, I never get tired of seeing how far these stories travel. Now, rewind with me to the night that flipped Ellie Marsh's whole life sideways. It started with a sound against the window panes, a low groan, the kind Ellie had heard once before, 3 years earlier, the night she'd buried her husband under a sky that hadn't shed a single drop of rain. She despised that sound. It had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with a memory she couldn't outrun. She was behind the counter, rag in one hand, wrench in the other, tallying up the day's take when the battered emergency radio on the shelf crackled awake. Asterisk tornado warning issued for the county. Effective immediately. Residents are urged to take shelter now. This is not a drill. Asterisk Ellie's hand went still on the counter. Not again, she breathed. Not tonight. She'd sat through more warnings than she could count. Oklahoma handed them out like weather itself was a chore. But something in the broadcaster's voice, the way it snapped on the word asterisk immediately asterisk, sent a chill straight up her spine. She moved. Fast. She'd run this drill alone 100 times, but never with her pulse slamming like a fist against her ribs. She flipped the sign to closed, threw the deadbolt, and started cranking the bay doors shut one, by hand, since the motor had burned out to winter's back, and there'd never been money to fix it. Come on, she muttered, wrestling the second door down. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, just starting to swell, sickly green, hanging low over the flat stretch of farmland behind Marsh's garage. She'd grown up beneath skies like that. She knew exactly what that color meant. Get underground, or get gone. She ran toward the back, toward the steel hatch her late husband Tom had welded into the concrete floor 4 years back, in the days when he still believed they'd raise kids in the apartment above the shop. When the future still looked like something worth pouring concrete for. You always did build things twice as strong as they needed to be, she whispered, kneeling to grip the hatch handle. She used to tease him about that. Now it was the only reason she was still breathing most storm seasons. The hatch groaned open. The smell of damp earth and old timber rose up around her. She clicked on the flashlight clipped just inside the frame and swept the beam down into the small shelter Tom had overbuilt. Reinforced steel walls, a bolted bench, a shelf of canned goods. She restocked every spring more out of habit than hope. One leg was already over the hatch when she heard it. Not thunder, not wind. Asterisk engines. Asterisk she froze. One hand braced against the cold frame, straining to make sense of a sound that didn't belong anywhere near a storm. It rolled and grew, mechanical, almost alive, cutting through the howling wind like something fighting asterisk against asterisk it instead of being carried along with it. What on earth? She murmured. Against every screaming instinct in her body. She climbed back out and moved toward the front windows. Through the grime and the first sideways sting of rain, she saw headlights. Not one, not two, dozens, rolling down the county highway like an advancing wall. Motorcycle after motorcycle, riders hunched low, fighting a crosswind already tearing shingles off the gas. Station roof across the road. Her stomach dropped as she watched one bike buckle sideways before the rider wrestled it straight again with the last possible second. There, Not stopping, she said to the empty shop. They'll never make the next town. She knew this highway better than her own name. The nearest real shelter, the storm cellar under the Baptist church, sat 11 miles out. There was no getting there. Not in this wind. Not with the funnel she could now make out, low and ugly, twisting down out of that bruised sky, a grey finger reaching for the ground. Her hand found the edge of the counter and gripped hard. Asterisk, this isn't your fight. Asterisk, said the voice in her head, the cold, practical one that had carried her through 3 years of grief, unpaid bills, and the bank that phoned every Tuesday like clockwork. Asterisk, get in your hole, seal the hatch, live through the night. Asterisk, but another voice, quieter, was already pulling her feet toward the door. Asterisk, Tom would never let you live this down. Asterisk, she threw the deadbolt open and stepped straight into a wind that nearly swept her off her feet. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in what felt like 10 minutes. Grit stung her cheeks. She threw up an arm to shield her eyes and screamed into the storm with everything she had. Over here. Pull in here. For one agonizing second, she thought the wind had swallowed her voice whole. Then the lead rider's head snapped toward her, and his arms shot out wide, waving the others in. 27. Motorcycles peeled off the highway and stormed into the gravel lot of Marsh's garage like cattle finding the last open gate ahead of her. Wildfire. The lead rider skidded to a stop just short of her boots, dropping the bike to steady it against the shoving wind. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere near 50, grey threading through a dark beard, a black leather cut heavy with patches snapping violently against his chest. Behind him, the others were dismounting fast, some limping, one man half carried between two others, his arm bent at an angle that turned Ellie's stomach. You got shelter. The lead rider shouted over the roar, his voice rough and urgent. None of the swagger she might have braced for from a man wearing that much leather. Underground, out back, Ellie shouted back. It's small, wasn't built for a crowd this size. It's gonna have to be, he said. We've got 3 men hurt bad, got caught wide open when this thing dropped out of nowhere. Her eyes swept the crowd flooding her lot. Engines dying one after another. The silence from each swallowed instantly by the coming storm. Some of these men looked exactly like every warning her mother had ever whispered about strangers, about bikers, about trusting the wrong people at the worst possible time. Ink crawled up necks, cuts bore patches she didn't recognize, and some she did. The kind that made small towns lock their doors the moment word got around that the iron suns were passing through. For one suspended heartbeat, she hesitated. Behind her, deep in the shop, the radio crackled again. Asterisk funnel confirmed on the ground, moving northeast, approximately 40 miles per hour. Residents in the path are urged to take shelter immediately. Asterisk, the lead rider caught the flicker of doubt cross her face. His jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, didn't do a single thing Ellie half expected a man like him to do when a woman stood between him and safety. Ma'am, he said, low and level even with the wind screaming around them both. I know exactly what you're looking at right now. I know what people say about men like us, but I've got 26 brothers behind me, and 3 of them might not walk out of this field if you shut that door. I'm not asking you to trust who we are. I'm asking you to let us live long enough to prove it. Something about the way he said it, not begging, not threatening, just laying the truth flat between them like a man with nothing left to bargain with, cracked something open in Ellie's chest. She thought of Tom. She thought of the shelter he'd built with his own hands. Over-engineered the way he over-engineered everything, because he always said the day you needed it to hold was no day to be finding out it couldn't. Get inside, she said. Now. The lead rider didn't move at first, like he hadn't quite believed she meant it. I said now. Ellie screamed, already sprinting toward the back of the shop, toward the hatch standing open like a mouth. It's out back. Follow me. Go, go, go. That single decision, made in less time than it takes a heart to skip and catch itself, was about to rewrite both their lives completely. What followed was chaos in its rawest form. 27 men, 3 of them badly hurt, trying to funnel through a hatch built to comfortably fit 6. Ellie stood at the top, directing traffic like a general who'd never asked to lead this particular war. Her voice roared from shouting over wind that kept climbing toward a shriek of its own. Watch the drop. It's steep. You with the arm. Let them lower you. Don't try to climb. Somebody grab his legs. A rider who couldn't have been older than 25 stumbled past her, clutching his ribs, face grey with pain. Ellie caught his good arm to steady him. I've got you, she said. Almost there. Thank you, he gasped. And then he vanished into the dark throat of the shelter below. The lead rider, Ellie still didn't have his name, stayed at the hatch the entire time, lowering the worst of the injured down into waiting arms, refusing to climb down himself until every last man was accounted for. That's 26, he muttered, counting under his breath, rain and sweat mixing on his face. Where's Rookie? Where the hell is Rookie? Here, I'm here. A voice called from near the front of the lot, and Ellie turned to see a young man, no older than 22, dragging a leg that clearly wasn't working right, blood soaking through denim at the thigh. That's when the wind chose to escalate into something that no longer sounded like weather at all. It sounded like a freight train tearing the sky itself in half. Ellie felt the pressure shift in her ears, felt her hair whip straight up and sideways at once. Move. The lead rider bellowed, already off the hatch and sprinting, closing the gap to the young man in seconds, throwing the kid's arm over his shoulders and half dragging him back toward the shelter, while debris cartwheeled across the lot behind them. A sheet of someone's roof, a trash can, a splintered fence board. Ellie's heart stopped as a 2x4 spun end over end through the air not 6 feet from where they ran. Faster, she screamed. It's right behind you. They hit the hatch at a dead sprint. The lead rider practically threw the young man. Ellie would learn his name was Jake, though everyone called him Rookie, down into the shelter before diving in after him. Ellie was right behind, grabbing the hatch handle with both hands, the wine trying to tear it from her grip. For one horrifying second, she thought she wouldn't have the strength to close it, that she'd be caught exposed on the surface when whatever was coming finally arrived. She braced her boots against the concrete lip and threw her whole body weight into it. The hatch slammed shut with a metallic boom that echoed through the tiny shelter, now packed wall to wall with 27 men and one widow. Above them, the world began to end. The sound was unlike anything Ellie had ever lived through, and she'd grown up in Tornado Alley her whole life. It wasn't a train, not really, whatever people always said. It was more like the sky had opened its mouth and started screaming, a roar so deep she felt it in her teeth, in the marrow of her bones, in the concrete beneath her boots humming with the violence happening just above their heads. The single bare bulb strung along the ceiling flickered twice and died. Someone gasped in the dark. Someone else swore. Then came the click of a lighter, a small orange flame lighting up the terrified, dirt-streaked face of a man who couldn't have been younger than 60. Grey stubble catching the light, his hand shaking as he held the flame steady. Everybody stay calm. The lead rider's voice cut through the darkness, commanding without being cruel. We've survived worse than this. Hold on to each other. Hold on to the walls. This your first storm? Someone asked. First one underground with a house about to fall on me. Another voice muttered. And despite everything, despite the impossible fear pressing down on every soul crammed into that concrete box, a few nervous laughs rippled through the dark. Ellie found herself pressed against the back wall. Jake slumped beside her, his breath shallow and fast. She could feel the heat radiating off his leg wound even through his jeans, and beneath the roar overhead, she heard him start to whimper. Hey, she said, finding his hand in the dark and gripping it. Hey, look at me. What's your name? Jake, he gasped. They call me Rookie. Okay, Jake. I'm Ellie. You're gonna be fine. You hear me? Breathe with me. It hurts, he groaned. It hurts so bad. I know it does. But you're alive. And that leg is going to heal. And someday, gonna tell somebody about the night you rode out a tornado in a hole in the ground with 26 of your brothers and a stranger who probably had better sense than to open that door. A weak, pained laugh escaped him. Good thing you didn't. Above them, Something enormous slammed into the earth close enough that grit sifted down from the ceiling into their hair, their eyes, their open mouths. Several grown men flinched. That was close, someone breathed. That was my shop, Ellie said quietly, and something in her chest went very still and very cold, even as her hands kept working, kept pressing down on Jake's wound in the dark, kept doing the only thing she knew how to do. Help, even while everything she owned was very likely being torn apart 11 feet above her head. The lead rider found his way to her side in the chaos, his voice low, meant only for her. You know that for sure, or you're guessing. I know the sound my roof makes when the wind gets under it wrong, Ellie said. Heard it before, never this bad. He was quiet a moment. I'm Marcus. Everybody calls me Hawk. Ellie, I know, Hawk said. You told Jake. I was listening. Another impact shook the ground, closer this time, and the whole shelter seemed to shudder like something alive and afraid. Ellie felt Hawk's hand find her shoulder in the dark, not gripping, just present, the same way he'd stayed at that hatch until every last man was counted. You didn't have to do this, Hawk said quietly, barely audible under the storm. You saw us pull up. You had every reason to bolt that door and let us figure it out ourselves. You had 3 men bleeding in a parking lot, Ellie said. There wasn't a decision to make. There's always a decision to make, Hawk said. Most people make the other one. Ellie didn't answer. She didn't know how to explain that somewhere in the last 10 minutes, the woman who'd spent 3 years keeping her head down, keeping her guard up, trusting almost no one, because trust was the thing ripped out of her chest right alongside her husband. That woman had made a choice without ever fully deciding to make it. The way a hand pulls back from flame before the brain even registers the heat. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but, by Ellie's best guess, was closer to 20 minutes. 20 minutes of a world coming apart above their heads, while 27 strangers and 1 widow sat pressed together in the dark, sharing breath, sharing fear, sharing the particular silence that only exists between people who don't know if they're about to die. Somewhere in those 20 minutes, Ellie heard men praying. She heard one gruff voice humming something that might have been a hymn or might have just been noise to fill the terrible gaps between the roars. She heard Jake's breathing even out slightly as the adrenaline finally answered the pressure he kept steady on his leg. She heard Hawk's voice, low and constant, checking in with each man by name, keeping count, keeping order, keeping 26 terrified riders from unraveling in a hole in the ground. And slowly, gradually, impossibly, the roar overhead began to fade. It didn't stop all at once. It receded the way a train recedes after passing, the sound pulling away, the pressure in Ellie's ears easing, the ground beneath her finally still. The wind outside dropped from a scream to a howl too. At last, something that resembled ordinary weather. Nobody moved for a long time. Is it over? Someone finally whispered. Don't know, Hawk said. Nobody move yet. Give it a few more minutes. They waited in silence, 28 held breaths in the dark, until the only sound left was rain, ordinary rain, falling steady and unremarkable against whatever remained above them. Okay, Hawk finally said. Somebody get that hatch. 2 of the uninjured riders climbed the small ladder bolted to the wall and pushed. It didn't budge on the first try. It stuck, one called down. Something's sitting on top of it. Push harder, Hawk called back. Both of you, together, on 3. They counted. 1, 2, 3, and threw their combined weight against it. The hatch groaned, resisted, and finally gave way with a shriek of metal. Grey daylight flooding down for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Ellie was first up the ladder, scrambling into air that snarled like torn earth and splintered wood and rain. And what she saw, when she straightened up, stole every remaining breath from her lungs. Her shop was gone. Not damaged, not battered. Asterisk gone. Asterisk the bay where she'd kept her husband's business alive for 3 years was now a scattered field of twisted metal and shattered lumber, flung across the lot and into the field beyond like a child's toy box kicked apart by something enormous and furious. The apartment above, The one she'd shared with Tom. The one that still held his clothes in the closet, and his coffee mug in the sink exactly where he'd left it on the last morning of his life, had simply ceased to exist. Behind her, one by one, the iron suns climbed out of the shelter into the grey, rain-soaked morning and stopped, staring alongside her at the devastation. "Ellie," Hawk said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I'm so sorry." She didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Her eyes moved slowly across the wreckage, cataloguing losses the way you'd count wounds after a battle. There was the sign snapped clean off its post, driven halfway into the ground 50 feet away. There was what might have once been the parts counter, now unrecognizable. And there, impossibly, a single wrench, Tom's favorite, lying untouched in the mud, as though the storm had spared it on purpose. Some final, cruel joke from a universe that had already taken everything else. 27 of you made it, Ellie finally said, her voice strange and distant even to her own ears. "Because I had a shelter to put you in." "Yes," Hawk said. "And I don't have anywhere to put myself anymore." Nobody had an answer for that. What was there to say? 27 grown men, some of the toughest, hardest living souls in the country, stood in absolute silence in the ruin of a stranger's life, because that stranger had opened a door instead of closing one. Jake, still pale, still favoring his wounded leg, was helped up out of the shelter and lowered onto an overturned crate that had somehow survived. He looked at the destruction, then at Ellie, and his young face crumpled. "You lost everything," he said. "You lost everything saving us." "I didn't lose you," Ellie said, and even in the wreckage of her own life, something in her voice held steady. "That's not nothing." Hawk studied her a long moment, rain dripping from the brim of the leather hat he'd somehow kept through the whole ordeal. "Ellie," he said slowly, "I need you to hear something, and I mean every word of it. What you did tonight, that's not a debt 27 men can pay off with a thank you and a handshake. That's not how this works. Not for us. I don't want anything," Ellie said. And she meant it even as her voice cracked, even as she looked out over the ruin of everything she'd built. "I did what anybody would have done." "No," Hawk said, and for the first time something sharp entered his voice. "You didn't do what anybody would have done. Anybody would have locked that door and prayed for the best. You looked at 27 strangers wearing the one patch this whole country's been taught to fear, and you let us in anyway. There's a difference between what people asterisk would asterisk do and what you asterisk did asterisk. Don't you ever let anybody, including yourself, tell you different." Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how cold the rain felt now that the adrenaline had drained away. Now that the immediate crisis had passed and left nothing behind but wreckage and the uncertain weight of a stranger's gratitude. "What happens now?" she asked, more to herself than to him. Hawk looked around, at the destruction, at his men, battered but alive, every single one of them alive, because of the woman standing in front of him. Something resolute settled into his jaw. "Now," he said, "we make some calls." Ellie didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. She was too deep in shock to register the significance of the phone Hawk pulled from an inside pocket. The way his thumb moved across the cracked screen, the low, urgent tone of his voice as he began speaking to someone on the other end. "It's Hawk," he said. Yeah, we're alive. Listen, I need you to hear something, and I need you to spread it fast." Ellie turned away, drawn toward the wreckage of her shop, toward the place the front counter used to stand, toward the small metal box bolted beneath it that held the only photograph she still had of Tom from their wedding day, curling at the edges, laminated against exactly this kind of disaster. Because some part of her had always known this day might come, she dug through splintered wood and torn insulation with bare hands, ignoring the cuts, ignoring the cold. Ellie, Jake's voice, weak but insistent, behind her. "Let one of us help. I've got it," she said, not looking up, not stopping. Two riders knelt beside her anyway, moving debris carefully, working alongside her in a silence that felt less like pity and more like solidarity. It took nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes of digging through the ruins of her marriage, her business, her entire adult life. Before her fingers closed around the small metal box, dented but intact, she pulled it free, sat back in the mud, and clutched it to her chest. And for the first time since the sirens had started screaming the night before, Ellie Marsh let herself cry. Nobody rushed her. Nobody told her it would be okay, because right then, it very clearly wasn't. The riders who'd knelt beside her simply stayed, a quiet, patient presence, giving her room to fall apart without being alone in it. When she finally looked up, wiping mud and tears from her face, she found Hawk standing a few feet away, phone still in hand, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Ellie," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and I don't want you worrying about what it means right now. I just need you to know it's happening." "What is?" "Word, already moving," Hawk said. "About what you did tonight. About 27 men alive, because a woman who'd never met a single one of us decided we were worth saving." "It's not that big a deal," Ellie said, wiping her face again, embarrassed, exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the storm. "Stop saying that," Hawk cut in, gentle but firm. "Please. Because it isn't true, and deep down I think you already know it isn't." Ellie didn't have an answer. She looked past him toward the highway, where 27 motorcycles sat scattered across her ruined lot, toward the flattened horizon, where the sun was starting to break weakly through grey clouds, lighting up a landscape that looked nothing like the town she'd woken up in the morning before. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I don't have insurance that covers this kind of damage. I don't have savings. I don't have." Her voice broke. "I don't have anything left." Hawk was quiet a long moment. "You've got 27 brothers now," he finally said. "And brothers don't leave family standing alone in the wreckage." Ellie let out a broken, disbelieving laugh, more exhaustion than humor. "You barely know me." "I know everything I need to," Hawk said. "I know you looked at a tornado and 27 strangers and chose to open a door instead of closing one. That tells me more about a person than 10 years of small talk ever could." Around them, the injured were being tended to with whatever remained undamaged, torn strips of shirt fabric doing the work of bandages, a belt cinch tight above a wound to slow the bleeding, low voices offering encouragement to men clearly in pain and trying not to show it in front of their brothers. Jake sat propped against the crate, watching Ellie with something like awe. "She digs through a collapsed building for a photograph," he said to no one in particular. "And she's worried about being a big deal." A few tired, rain-soaked laughs rippled through the group, the first real lightness since the storm hit. And Ellie managed a small, exhausted smile despite everything. "I need to call the county," she said, forcing herself back into practical thinking. "See what kind of emergency services are even coming this way, given how bad this looks." "Ellie," something in Hawk's tone made her pause. "Before you do that, I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually think about the answer." "What?" "This land." He looked out over the ruined shop, the flattened building, the debris scattered across acres that had belonged to the Marsh family for 3 generations. "Who else knows what happened to it besides us?" Ellie frowned. "Nobody yet. I don't think. The whole town got hit last night. From what I heard on the radio before it cut out, everybody's probably dealing with their own damage." Hawk nodded slowly, something calculating moving behind his eyes that Ellie didn't fully understand yet. Wouldn't understand for weeks, not until the full weight of what was coming arrived on her doorstep and changed this whole town forever. "Okay," he said. "Let's get everybody stable first. Get Jake and Marcus and Deacon looked at properly. Then we'll figure out the rest." Ellie nodded. Too exhausted to roar to push further, to ask what exactly Hawk meant by the rest to notice the way several riders exchanged glances behind her back, the way phones were already being pulled out across the wreckage-strewn lot, low voices spreading word to chapters Ellie Marsh had never heard of and couldn't possibly have imagined were about to hear her name. She busied herself instead with what she knew how to do, tending wounds, salvaging what supplies had survived, keeping her hands moving so her mind wouldn't have to sit still long enough to absorb everything she'd lost in the last 12 hours. She found an old first aid kit, miraculously intact beneath a collapsed shelf, and set to work properly cleaning Jake's wound, while Hawk supervised a few feet away. Phone pressed to his ear again, voice low and urgent. 27 of us. Yeah, we'd have died out there if she hadn't opened that door. No, I'm serious, preacher. I need this to move fast. Tell them all. Every chapter that can hear you. Ellie didn't catch all of it. Focused as she was on threading a bandage around Jake's thigh, ignoring the way her hands had started to shake, as that the immediate danger had passed and the full weight of everything ahead was starting to settle into her bones. You're good at this, Jake said quietly, watching her work. My husband used to say I should have been a nurse instead of a mechanic's wife, Ellie said, then went still, surprised at herself, at how easily Tom's memory had slipped into conversation with a stranger. Used to be. Jake asked gently. He passed 3 years ago. She tied off the bandage. Heart attack. 41 years old. Fixed cars his whole life. And it was his own heart that finally gave out. I'm sorry. Everybody is, Ellie said. No bitterness in it. Just a tired kind of truth. Doesn't change much. Jake studied her. This shop. It was his. His father's before that. 3 generations kept this land running. She looked out over the ruined lot. The twisted metal, the scattered lumber that used to be walls and a roof and the life. Guess that's over now. Don't say that, Jake said, surprising her with sudden intensity. Don't you dare say that. You don't know Hawk. You don't know what he's like when somebody does right by one of us. This isn't over, Ellie. This isn't even close to over. Before Ellie could ask what he meant, Hawk's voice cut across the lot, calling everyone's attention. His phone lowered, his expression carrying a gravity that silenced the scattered conversations immediately. Listen up, Hawk said, and every rider, injured or not, turned toward him. I know we're all running on fumes. I know everybody's hurting. But before we do anything else, I need every man here to understand something. He paused, his eyes finding Ellie across the ruined lot, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her breath catch. This woman put her life on the line for every single one of us last night. She had a warm, safe hole in the ground built for her and her alone. Instead of locking herself inside it, she stood out in a tornado and dragged 27 strangers to safety. She lost her home doing it. She lost her business doing it. She may have lost everything her family ever built doing it. Nobody spoke. The only sound was rainwater dripping off shattered lumber, off leather, off bowed heads. We don't leave that unanswered, Hawk said, his voice hard now, certain, carrying the weight of a man who'd made a decision and would not be talked out of it. Not today, not ever. Every man here is going to remember this night. And every man here is going to make sure the whole club remembers it too. Because what Ellie Marsh did here, that's the kind of thing that reminds people why the patch is supposed to mean something. A low murmur of agreement rolled through the group, rough voices, tired voices, but united. Ellie stood frozen at the edge of the wreckage, watching 27 battered strangers nod in solemn agreement with a man she'd known less than 12 hours, feeling something she couldn't quite name settle into her chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something adjacent to it, something that hadn't visited her in the 3 long years since she'd buried her husband and started learning how to survive entirely alone. She didn't know yet what Hawk's promise would come to mean, didn't know that phones were already ringing in cities she'd never visited, that her name was already being spoken in clubhouses and garages and roadside bars from Oklahoma to Texas and beyond, carried by men who understood a debt when they saw one and had no intention of leaving it unpaid. She didn't know that the empty highway past her ruined shop would, in the weeks to come, fill with more motorcycles than this small town had ever seen in its entire history. All Ellie Marsh knew, standing in the wreckage of everything she'd built, rain finally slowing to a drizzle around her, was that for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't standing completely alone. And somewhere out on that highway, engines were already turning toward home, carrying word of a debt 27 men intended to repay in full. The rain had thinned to a fine mist by the time the first siren cut through the wreckage of the town, but Ellie barely registered it over the ringing still trapped in her ears from 20 minutes underground. She turned to see red and blue light strobbing weakly through the grey morning, an ambulance and a single sheriff's cruiser bouncing over debris that used to be a road. Finally, Hawk muttered, already moving toward the vehicles, waving his arms overhead. Over here. We've got 3 injured. 1 bad. The paramedics moved fast, but Ellie noticed the way the sheriff hung back near his cruiser, one hand resting on his belt, eyes scanning the crowd of leather, and ink gathered across her ruined lot like he was doing math. He didn't like the answer to, "Ma'am," the sheriff called, voice carrying a weary edge. "You all right? These men bothering you?" Ellie wiped mud from her face, straightened her spine, and looked him dead in the eye. "These men are alive because I let them into my shelter, Sheriff Doyle. And I'm alive because they carried me through a door I couldn't have gotten to on my own. Nobody's bothering anybody. We survived a tornado together. That's all that happened here." Doyle's eyes moved slowly across the group, lingering on the patches, the vests, the ink, and Ellie could see the old assumptions working behind his expression. The same ones she'd fought down herself less than an hour earlier. "That true?" he asked Hawk directly. "Every word," Hawk said, not backing down, not raising his voice either. "You can check with the county. We got caught out on the highway when the funnel touched down. This woman opened her shelter to 27 strangers when she had every reason not to. You want to arrest somebody, Sheriff. Arrest the storm." Doyle held Hawk's gaze a long moment, then exhaled and looked away. "Get that boy to County General. I want to look at the rest of you before you go anywhere. Storm knocked off this county flat. I don't need trouble on top of it." "There isn't going to be any trouble," Ellie said. "I give you my word." Something in the way she said it, flat, certain, unwilling to be argued with, made the sheriff's shoulders drop half an inch. He nodded once, short and clipped, and moved off toward his cruiser to radio in the damaged dock. Jake was loaded onto a stretcher, pale and sweating, his hand finding Ellie's wrist as they lifted him. "Hey," he rasped, "you're gonna be here when I get back, right?" "Where else would I be?" Ellie said, forcing a smile she didn't fully feel. "Somebody's got to keep an eye on this mess. Promise me," Jake said, more urgent than the moment called for, his young face suddenly tight with something that looked like fear that had nothing to do with his leg. "I promise," Ellie said, and meant it, though she had no idea yet what that promise would cost her. 2 more riders, the ones Hawk had called Marcus and Deacon, were loaded in behind him, one with a dislocated shoulder strapped tight against his chest, the other favoring ribs gone an ugly shade of purple beneath a torn shirt. The ambulance doors slammed, the siren rose, and within seconds it was gone down the shattered remains of the highway, carrying 3 of Ellie's 27 strangers toward a hospital already overwhelmed with half the county's storm wounded. That left 24 iron sons standing in the mud and wreckage of Marsh's garage, and one woman who'd lost everything she owned in a single night. "Okay," Hawk said, turning back to the group, rain dripping off the brim of his hat. "Listen up. We're not leaving her like this." A murmur of agreement rolled through the men, but Ellie shook her head, already stepping forward. "You don't have to do this. You've got your own lives, your own families waiting to hear if you made it. I'll manage, Emily." Hawk's voice was gentle but immovable, the same tone he'd used at the hatch when he'd told her they weren't leaving without every last man accounted for. "You dragged 27 strangers out of a tornado. Least we can do is help you find your kitchen sink." A few tired laughs broke the tension, and despite everything, despite the grief sitting like a stone in her chest, Ellie felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. "Fine," she said, "but somebody's got to call the utility company about that downed line by the road before one of you idiots gets electrocuted playing hero twice in one day." "Yes, Mum," one of the older riders said, already peeling off toward his bike to make the call. And just like that, without any further debate, 24 men who owed her everything got to work clearing the wreckage of a life they'd only known for 12 hours. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, dragging splintered lumber into piles, salvaging what tools and parts could be recovered, tarping over the exposed section of the apartment that hadn't collapsed entirely. Ellie found herself directing men twice her size, like she'd been doing it her whole life, more than once catching herself almost laughing at the sight of leather-clad bikers hauling debris shoulder to shoulder like the world's most unlikely construction crew. "You know," said an older rider with a grey beard and a patch that read SGT at arms, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "In 30 years riding with this club, I've seen a lot of things. Never seen Hawk order an entire chapter to spend their afternoon shoveling mud for a stranger." "I'm not really a stranger anymore, am I?" Ellie said, hauling a bent piece of sheet metal toward the growing scrap pile. The old rider studied her a moment. "No, ma'am, reckon you're not." By the time the lights started fading, the worst of the immediate debris had been cleared, exposing just how thorough the destruction really was. The shop's foundation stood bare and scarred, the apartment above a skeleton of exposed beams. Ellie stood in the middle of it all, hands raw and blistered, and felt exhaustion finally catch up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the last 20 hours. Hawk found her there, staring at nothing, and settled beside her without a word. "We can't stay forever," he finally said. "Some of the men have families 3 states over who don't know yet if they're alive. I've got to get them home, get the injured ones properly looked after." "But Ellie," he turned to face her fully, "this isn't goodbye. You understand that?" "You said that already," Ellie said quietly. "Back before the ambulance came. Meant it then. Mean it more now." Hawk reached into his vest and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, pressing it into her hand. "That's a number. Not mine. A landline at a clubhouse 200 miles from here. Manned around the clock. Anything happens, anything at all, insurance trouble, somebody trying to take advantage while you're down, you call that number, and you say my name. You understand me?" Ellie looked down at the number, the ink already blurring slightly from the damp, and felt something tighten in her throat. "I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Hawk said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced any further argument. "This is a debt, and debts like this, we don't forget. Not this club, not ever." Ellie folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her jacket, one of the only pieces of clothing she had left that wasn't soaked through with mud and rain. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt far too small for what they were meant to carry. By nightfall, the motorcycles rolled out one by one down the battered highway, engines echoing across a landscape that looked more like a war zone than a farming town. Ellie stood alone in the ruins of her family's business and watched the taillights fade into the dark. And for the first time since the sirens had started screaming the night before, the silence around her felt enormous, hollow, absolute. She didn't cry again. She'd already emptied herself out once that day, kneeling in the mud with Tom's photograph clutched to her chest. Instead, she climbed down into the shelter that had saved 27 lives, pulled the hatch shut behind her, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had simply run out of anything left to fight with. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of insurance calls, county assessments, and the particular exhaustion of trying to rebuild a life from nothing. The town, it turned out, had been hit hard across 3 separate neighborhoods, and Ellie quickly discovered that being one of dozens of families filing storm claims meant waiting in lines, waiting on hold, waiting for adjusters stretched thin across a county full of disaster. It was nearly 2 weeks before Roland Pratt, the adjuster assigned to her claim, finally pulled his sedan into what remained of her gravel lot. He was thin, sharp-featured, wearing a rain jacket that looked too clean for someone supposedly touring storm damage all day, and he barely glanced at Ellie before pulling out a tablet and beginning to circle the wreckage with the brisk efficiency of a man checking boxes rather than assessing a life. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, not looking up from his screen. I've reviewed the initial photos your neighbor submitted along with your claim. I have to be upfront with you. This doesn't look promising. What do you mean, not promising? Ellie asked, following him across the lot. The whole building's gone. The apartment, the shop, everything. Your policy covers wind damage up to a certain threshold, Pratt said, still not making eye contact. But there's a structural pre-existing condition clause here that's going to complicate things significantly. Your file shows the roof was flagged for wear during your last renewal inspection 3 years ago. Ellie felt the ground shift beneath her. That inspection was routine. Every shop that age gets flagged for something, be that as it may, Pratt said, tapping something into his tablet. The company's position is likely going to be that the pre-existing wear contributed materially to the extent of the collapse. That puts us in a grey area regarding full replacement value. A grey area, Ellie repeated, voice flat with disbelief. My husband built that shop with his own hands. It survived 20 years of storms before this one. You're telling me that because of a routine flag on a form, I might not get covered at all? I'm telling you it's complicated, Pratt said, finally looking up. Something in his expression, to smooth, to rehearsed, made the hair on the back of Ellie's neck rise the same way it had the night the sirens first went off. I'll have a formal determination for you within 30 days. 30 days, Mr. Pratt. I don't have 30 days. I don't have a roof over my head. I've been sleeping in a shelter meant for emergencies, not for living. I understand this is difficult, Pratt said, in a tone that suggested he understood nothing at all. But I have to follow the process. In the meantime, I'd recommend looking into your other options. What other options? Pratt hesitated, just for a second, just long enough that Ellie caught it. There are parties in the area interested in storm-damaged properties, he said carefully. Sometimes a clean sale is less complicated than a lengthy rebuild, especially for a property this size. Given the current market, something cold settled in Ellie's stomach. Are you seriously standing in the wreckage of my family's business, telling me to sell it before you've even finished deciding whether you're going to cover the damage? I'm simply saying it's an option worth considering, Pratt said, already retreating toward his car, tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. I'll be in touch, Mrs. Marsh. He drove off before Ellie could say another word, leaving her alone in the mud, staring after him with a slow, dawning unease she couldn't quite name, but that would come to define the next several weeks of her life in ways she never could have predicted. The bank called the following Tuesday. Mrs. Marsh, this is regarding your outstanding balance on the commercial property loan, said a voice that sounded as tired of making these calls as Ellie was of receiving them. We understand you've experienced significant property damage, and we want to work with you, but I have to inform you the grace period on missed payments is limited. If we don't receive some indication of resolution within 60 days, the bank will be forced to begin foreclosure proceedings. Foreclose, Ellie repeated, gripping the phone so hard her knuckles went white. On a building that doesn't exist anymore, on the land. Mrs. Marsh, the loan is secured against the property itself. Ellie hung up without saying goodbye, sat down hard on the edge of the shelter's ladder, and pressed both hands against her face, breathing slow and deliberate, refusing to let the panic climbing up her throat win. Tom would know what to do. She thought, then hated herself for the thought, because Tom wasn't here, hadn't been here for 3 years, and the entire weight of keeping his family's legacy alive had rested on her shoulders alone since the day they'd lowered him into the ground. She thought about the folded scrap of paper in her jacket pocket. She'd looked at it a dozen times over the past 2 weeks, turned it over in her fingers, told herself she wasn't desperate enough yet to use it. That calling a stranger's clubhouse over a bank problem felt like exactly the kind of overreaction that would make Hawk regret ever handing it to her. She didn't call. Not yet. Instead, she went back to work, salvaging what tools she could, taking on small repair jobs out of the open-air remains of her bay, running a borrowed generator for basic diagnostics, determined to prove to the bank, to the insurance company, to herself, that the garage wasn't finished yet. It was 3 days later that the black sedan first appeared. Ellie was elbow-deep in a customer's carburetor when the car pulled into the lot, sleek and out of place against the scarred landscape, and a man in an expensive coat stepped out with the easy confidence of someone who had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, extending a hand she didn't take. "Von Ashcroft. I represent Ashcroft Land Holdings. I understand you've had quite the ordeal." "I've had a tornado," Ellie said, wiping grease from her hands with a rag instead of shaking his. "What can I do for you, Mr. Ashcroft?" "Straight to business." "I like that." Ashcroft smiled, a polished, gleaming thing that never reached his eyes. "My company's been acquiring storm-affected properties across the county, helping folks who are underwater on rebuilding costs get a fair price and a clean exit. I understand your claims gotten complicated. I'd like to make you an offer that solves that problem entirely." He named a figure. Ellie knew instantly. It was less than half of what the land alone was worth, to say nothing of 3 generations of family history built into every inch of it. "That's insulting," Ellie said flatly. "I understand it might feel that way," Ashcroft said, unbothered, still smiling. "But given your current situation, the loan, the disputed insurance claim, the cost of rebuilding from scratch, I'd encourage you to think practically rather than emotionally. These things have a way of getting harder before they get easier." Mrs. Marsh, something about the specific way he'd said it, asterisk the disputed insurance claim asterisk, snagged in Ellie's mind like a hook catching fabric. "How do you know about my insurance claim?" she asked slowly. "That's not public information." For the briefest flicker, something shifted behind Ashcroft's polished expression. There and gone so fast Ellie almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. "Small county," he said smoothly. Word travels, Ellie repeated, watching him carefully now. The mechanic in her running diagnostics on a different kind of engine entirely, listening for the telltale knock of something not quite right. "Mr. Ashcroft, I think you should leave now." "Of course," Ashcroft said, unbothered, already retreating toward his car. "The offer stands for 30 days. I'd think carefully." Mrs. Marsh, rebuilding this place from nothing, alone, with a foreclosure clock ticking. That's a very long road for one person to walk by herself. He drove off, and Ellie stood in the settling dust with her heart hammering, turning his words over and over. The phrase asterisk the disputed insurance claim asterisk echoing louder each time. That night, unable to sleep in the cramped confines of the shelter, Ellie dug out the folder of paperwork Pratt had left with her. Copies of the claim assessment, the pre-existing condition flag, the initial denial letter that had arrived that same afternoon, cold and bureaucratic, citing exactly the roof inspection issue Pratt had warned her about weeks earlier. She read it 3 times before something caught her eye. A small notation at the bottom. A case reference number matching a filing prefix she didn't recognize, on a hunch, working by flashlight with her laptop balanced on her knees. Battery running dangerously low. Ellie searched the prefix. What she found made her blood run cold. The prefix belonged to a private adjustment firm, a subcontractor the insurance company used for complicated claims, a firm that, according to a county business registry she dug up after 20 increasingly frantic minutes of searching, was partially owned by a holding company whose registered agent's address matched almost exactly the address listed for Ashcroft Land Holdings. Roland Pratt didn't just work for the insurance company. He was, in some tangled corporate way Ellie didn't fully understand yet, connected to the very man trying to buy her land out from under her for pennies on the dollar. "Oh my God," Ellie whispered into the dark, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen. This wasn't an accident. This was never an accident. She sat there a long time, the flashlight beam trembling with the shake in her hands, piecing it together with the slow, sick clarity of someone finally seeing the trap she'd already half stepped into. The pre-existing condition flag, the convenient 30-day determination window that lined up perfectly with Ashcroft's own 30-day offer deadline, the foreclosure timeline the bank had cited, which, heart-pounding, she checked, matched almost exactly the timeline Ashcroft had referenced in his own visit. as though he already knew precisely how long she had before the walls closed in completely. They weren't circling a storm victim. They were executing a plan. Ellie didn't sleep at all that night. She sat in the shelter, her back against cold concrete, staring at the folded scrap of paper Hawk had given her, turning it over and over as the first grey light of dawn crept down through the open hatch above her. Asterisk, anything happens, anything at all. You call that number? Asterisk, but what could 27 bikers from 3 states away actually do about a corrupt insurance adjuster and a predatory developer with paperwork and lawyers on their side? This wasn't a tornado. This wasn't something you could carry a person through. This was slow, bureaucratic, suffocating, the kind of fight that ground people down not through violence, but through exhaustion, through 30-day windows and denied claims and phone calls that went unanswered until you finally, wearily signed whatever was put in front of you just to make it stop. She thought about calling right then. Her fingers actually found her phone, pulled up the keypad, hovered over the digits. Then she stopped. Asterisk, they already gave you enough. Asterisk, she told herself. Asterisk, they pulled you into a night you can't ever repay. You don't get to call in more favors over a fight that might not even be winnable. Asterisk, she put the phone down and told herself she'd handle it alone. The way she'd handled everything alone for 3 years. It was a decision she would come to regret, though not for the reasons she expected. Over the following 2 weeks, Ellie threw herself into building a case. She drove 40 minutes to the county courthouse and pulled every public record she could find on Ashcroft land holdings, discovering a pattern that made her stomach turn. 3 other storm-damaged properties across the county, all purchased within weeks of denied or delayed insurance claims, all processed through the same adjustment subcontractor, all sold at a fraction of assessed value to families who, according to hushed phone conversations Ellie had with 2 of the other sellers, had felt exactly the same slow, suffocating pressure she was feeling now. We didn't have a choice, one elderly woman told her, voice thin and defeated over a bad phone connection. The bank was going to take it anyway. At least this way we got something. Did you know the adjuster and the beer were connected? Ellie asked. A long pause. No, nobody told us that. Would it have mattered? We still would have lost the fight either way. Folks like us don't win against folks like that. Ellie hung up with her jaw clenched, so tight it ached. A fury building in her chest that was different from grief, sharper, more useful. She wasn't going to be another name of Vaughan Ashcroft's quiet list of quietly broken families, but knowing you were being cheated and proving it in a way that mattered were 2 very different things. And as the days ticked down toward both the insurance company's final determination and Ashcroft's 30-day offer window, Ellie found herself running out of time faster than she was running out of resolve. The bank sent a formal notice, 30 days remaining before foreclosure proceedings would officially begin. The insurance company sent its final determination 2 days later. Claims substantially denied, citing the pre-existing structural condition, offering a settlement so small it wouldn't cover a quarter of the cost to clear the remaining debris, let alone rebuild. And that same afternoon, Vaughan Ashcroft's black sedan rolled back into the lot right on schedule, like a predator that had been patiently watching the clock the entire time. Mrs. Marsh, he said, stepping out with the same easy, gleaming smile. I hope you've had time to think things over. I know what you did, Ellie said, standing her ground in the middle of the wreckage that used to be her livelihood, arms crossed, voice steady despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her face. I know about Pratt. I know about the other families. I know exactly how this works. Mr. Ashcroft. For a moment, something flickered across Ashcroft's face. Not guilt, Ellie realized with cold clarity, but mild, condescending amusement. The expression of a man who'd heard this particular accusation before and never once lost sleep over it. That's a very creative theory, Mrs. Marsh, he said. I'd be careful throwing around accusations like that without proof. Slander is expensive, and from where I'm standing, expensive isn't exactly your strong suit right now. I have records, Ellie said. Even as she said it, She heard how thin it sounded, how a stack of public filings and a hunch about matching addresses probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes against a team of corporate lawyers. "I'm sure you do," Ashcroft said, unbothered, reaching into his coat and producing a thick manila envelope, holding it out with the casual cruelty of a man offering a drowning woman a single, barely adequate life preserver. "This is my final offer. It expires at 5 o'clock tomorrow. After that, I withdraw it entirely. The bank forecloses, and you walk away with nothing at all instead of something. I'd think very carefully about which outcome serves you better, Mrs. Marsh." Ellie didn't take the envelope. She stood perfectly still, staring at him, feeling something in her chest crack under the sheer grinding weight of it all. The storm, the grief, the insurance company, the bank, and now this man standing in the ruins of her husband's legacy with a smile like a closing trap. "Get off my property," she said quietly. "It's barely your property anymore," Ashcroft said, but he set the envelope down on the hood of her truck anyway, unbothered, already turning back toward his car. 5 o'clock tomorrow, Mrs. Marsh. Think hard. He drove off, gravel crunching under expensive tires, and Ellie stood alone in the settling dust, staring down at the envelope sitting on her truck like an accusation, like a countdown, like the final page of a story she'd never agreed to be written into. She didn't sleep that night either. She sat in the shelter, the envelope unopened on the bench beside her, and finally, for the first time since Hawk had pressed that scrap of paper into her hand, she pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. Ellie's heart sank with each unanswered ring, the old fear creeping back in that the promise had been nothing more than the adrenaline of a shared survival. That men who rode off into the night didn't actually mean it when they said, "This isn't goodbye." On the 6th ring, a rough voice answered. "Yeah, hi. I'm sorry to call so late." Ellie's voice cracked despite every effort to keep it steady. "My name is Ellie Marsh. Hawk gave me this number. He told me to." "Ellie Marsh," the voice on the other end repeated, and something in the tone shifted immediately, sharpened, came fully alert. "The Ellie Marsh from the storm." "Yeah," Ellie said, startled. "You know who I am." "Ma'am, every chapter east of the Mississippi knows who you are," the voice said. Hold on right there. Don't hang up." Ellie heard muffled voices in the background, urgent, overlapping, someone shouting a name she didn't catch. The scrape of a chair, footsteps, and then a familiar voice, rough with sleep, but instantly fully awake the moment he understood who was on the line. "Ellie." "Hawk," Ellie said, and felt something in her chest finally give way. 3 weeks of held-together composure cracking all at once. "I'm sorry. I know it's late. I know you've probably got your own life to get back to. I didn't know who else to call." "Ellie, slow down," Hawk said, his voice steady, grounding, cutting through the panic rising in her throat. "Tell me what's happening right now." "Everything." And so, sitting alone in the shelter that had saved 27 lives, with a countdown ticking toward 5 o'clock the next afternoon, and an envelope full of a stranger's cruelty sitting on the bench beside her, Ellie Marsh told Marcus Hawk Reynolds everything. The adjuster, the pre-existing condition flag, the matching addresses, the pattern of families quietly broken and bought out across the county, the bank's foreclosure clock, Ashcroft's smile, the offer expiring in less than 18 hours. There was a long silence on the other end when she finished, long enough that Ellie wondered if the call had dropped. "Hawk, are you still there?" "I'm here," Hawk said, and his voice had changed entirely, gone flat and cold, and absolutely certain in a way that made the hair rise on Ellie's arms. "Ellie, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't sign anything. Don't take that meeting tomorrow. Don't do anything but sit tight and wait." "Wait for what?" Ellie asked, voice barely a whisper. There was another pause, and when Hawk spoke again, there was something in his voice Ellie hadn't heard from him even in the middle of the tornado, even with 3 men bleeding and a funnel cloud bearing down, something that sounded almost like relief, like a man who'd finally, after weeks of waiting, been handed exactly the fight he'd been hoping for. You saved 27 of my brothers, Hawk said. You think this club forgets a debt like that over some paperwork and a crooked insurance man? Ellie, I need you to trust me on this one more time. The same way you trusted us with that shelter door. Don't sign. Don't sell. Don't give that man one single inch tomorrow. Hawk, I don't understand what you think you can do. You don't need to understand it yet, Hawk said. You just need to hold that line for one more day. Can you do that? Ellie looked at the envelope sitting on the bench, at the shadow of everything she stood to lose if she guessed wrong, if she trusted a promise made by strangers over the cold, immediate certainty of a check that could at least stop the bleeding. Yes, she said finally, her voice small but steady. Yes, I can do that. Good, Hawk said. Now get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. The line went dead before Ellie could ask him what he meant, before she could ask what exactly a man 200 miles away thought he could do about a corporation, a corrupt adjuster, and a bank foreclosure clock that didn't care about promises made in the wreckage of a tornado. She sat in the dark a long time afterward, phone still clutched in her hands, staring up through the open hatch in a sky finally clear of storm clouds, scattered with more stars than she'd seen in years. Somewhere out there, engines she couldn't yet hear were already starting to turn. Morning came slow and grey, the kind of pale Oklahoma dawn that made everything look like it was still deciding whether to be a good day or a bad one. Ellie hadn't really slept. She drifted in and out on the shelter bench, foam clutched against her chest like a lifeline, replaying Hawk's voice over and over until the words stopped sounding like a promise and started sounding like something she might have imagined out of pure desperation. Asterisk, don't sign, don't sell, don't give that man one single inch. Asterisk, she climbed out of the shelter a little after 6, joints stiff, eyes burning, and found the envelope exactly where she'd left it, sitting on the bench like a coiled snake pretending to be paperwork. She didn't touch it. She made herself a cup of instant coffee on the little camp stove she'd been using for 2 weeks, wrapped her hands around the tin cup for warmth, and watched the sun try to burn through the low clouds over the flattened tree line. By 7, her phone buzzed. Not Hawk, a number she didn't recognize. Local area code. Mrs. Marsh, this is Denise from the County Gazette. I'm doing a follow-up piece on storm recovery efforts, and I understand you had quite the experience the night of the tornado. Something about a large group of motorcyclists. Ellie's stomach tightened. Who told you that? It's a small county, Denise said. An echo of Ashcroft's exact words 2 days earlier that made Ellie's skin crawl. Word travels. I'd love to get a quote from you about what happened. I don't have anything to say right now, Ellie said, and hung up before the reporter could push further. Unease settling deeper into her chest. Word was moving in directions she didn't like, faster than she could control, and she didn't yet know whether that was Hawk's doing or Ashcroft's, whether it would help her or bury her. By 8:30, Roland Pratt's sedan rolled into the lot, and Ellie felt her whole body go rigid at the sight of him climbing out, tablet in hand, that same rehearsed, unbothered smile fixed in place like he hadn't spent the last 2 weeks quietly gutting her. Mrs. Marsh, he said, I wanted to stop by personally and walk you through your appeal options given the final determination. You mean given the determination you helped rig? Ellie said flatly. Pratt's smile flickered, the same tell she'd caught weeks earlier, standing in this exact spot. I'm not sure what you're implying, but I'd strongly advise against making accusations you can't substantiate. That kind of talk can complicate things significantly for you. Complicate things, Ellie repeated, like they're not already complicated enough. Like a bank isn't foreclosing on land my husband's grandfather cleared with his own hands. Right around the same time, Vaughn Ashcroft just happens to show up waving a check. Asterisk. Coincidences happen. Mrs. Marsh, Pratt's voice had lost its earlier warmth entirely, gone thin and clipped. I came here as a courtesy. If you'd rather handle this adversarially, that's your prerogative, but I promise you it won't end well for you. Get off my property, Ellie said. The second time in 2 days she'd said those exact words to a man in an expensive coat. And something about saying it twice made her feel less like a victim and more like a woman drawing a line she intended to hold. Pratt left without another word, tire spitting gravel. Ellie stood alone again in the ruin of her lot, heart hammering, watching the clock on her phone tick toward 9, then 10, then 11, each hour dragging like wet cement. Ashcroft's 5 o'clock deadline looming larger with every passing minute. She called Hawk twice that morning. Both times it rang through to nothing. No answer, no voicemail, just endless ringing that made her chest tighten with a fear she didn't want to name. The fear that she'd trusted a promise made in the exhausted, adrenaline-soaked aftermath of a tornado. A promise that men said and meant in the moment and simply couldn't keep once real life and real logistics got in the way. By noon, she was pacing. By 1, she'd opened the envelope despite herself, just to look, just to remind herself what she was fighting against, and found the number even smaller than she remembered. Insultingly small, a number that treated 3 generations of blood and sweat like a rounding error. She shoved it back in the envelope and threw it across the lot, watching it skid into the mud, and immediately felt a stab of panic, having done something so reckless with what might be her only real offer. Asterisk hold the line. Asterisk she told herself, retrieving it, brushing off the mud, smoothing the creases like it mattered. Like any of it mattered. If the man who told her to hold that line had already forgotten her, the moment his bike disappeared down the highway. At 2:30, another car pulled into the lot. Not Ashcroft's sedan this time, but a county utility truck. A man in a hard hat climbed out with a clipboard and an expression Ellie was beginning to recognize as the universal look of someone about to deliver bad news they didn't personally feel responsible for. Mrs. Marsh, I'm here about the property line dispute filing. The what? Ellie's stomach dropped through the floor. I haven't filed anything. No, ma'am. The filings against you. Ashcroft Land Holdings submitted a boundary dispute this morning. Claims your east fence line encroaches on an adjacent parcel they acquired last year. Pending resolution. The county's putting a hold on any permits for rebuild construction on that section. Ellie stood absolutely still, feeling the trap tighten another notch, understanding with sudden, sick clarity exactly what was happening. Not one attack, but a dozen small ones arriving from every direction at once, each designed not to destroy her outright, but to exhaust her, to make the alternative, Ashcroft's shrinking offer, look more reasonable with every passing hour. This is insane, she said, mostly to herself. This is absolutely insane. I just deliver the paperwork, ma'am, the utility man said, not unkindly, sliding the notice into her hands before retreating quickly to his truck, clearly wanting no part of whatever was unfolding on this property. Ellie read the boundary dispute filing twice, hands shaking, and felt something in her chest crack under the accumulated weight of it. The insurance denial, the foreclosure clock, the reporter calling about bikers like it was some kind of tabloid curiosity. And now this, a fabricated property dispute, timed with surgical precision to arrive on the exact day Ashcroft's offer expired. She sat down hard on the tailgate of her truck, the notice crumpling in her fist, and for the first time since the tornado itself, Ellie Marsh felt something close to despair, not the sharp, immediate grief of loss, but the slow, grinding despair of watching a system built by powerful people quietly, methodically close every door around her, one bureaucratic form at a time. Her phone buzzed. She nearly didn't answer, certain it was another piece of bad news. It was Hawk. Ellie. His voice was rushed, urgent, wind noise roaring behind him like he was riding at speed. Sorry I missed your calls. We've been moving fast all morning. Tell me what's happening right now. Ellie's voice cracked as it all came pouring out. Pratt's visit, the reporter's call, the boundary dispute, the permits frozen, the 5 o'clock deadline bearing down like a wall she couldn't see over. There was a beat of silence on the line, filled only by wind. Ellie, Hawk said, and his voice had gone hard again, the same flat, dangerous calm she'd heard the night before. I need you to look at the clock. What time is it there? Almost 3. Okay. A pause. Muffled voices in the background. Someone shouting something Ellie couldn't make out. Okay. Ellie, I need you to hold that line for 2 more hours. Just 2. Can you do that? Hawk, there's a fabricated property dispute freezing my construction permits. There's a reporter asking questions I don't know how to answer. Ashcroft's deadline is at 5. And if I don't have something to tell him, you don't need to tell him anything, Hawk said. You don't answer that man. You don't sign anything. You don't negotiate. You don't even open that door if he shows up. You understand? Hawk, what is happening? Ellie's voice broke on the question, raw and exhausted. Please, just tell me what's happening. Another pause, longer this time, and when Hawk spoke again, there was something almost gentle underneath the urgency. Something that steadied Ellie despite everything crumbling around her. What's happening? Hawk said. Is that for the last 2 weeks? Well, you've been fighting this alone because you were too proud to make one more call. I've had people pulling every thread connected to Vaughan Ashcroft and Roland Pratt across 4 counties. What's happening is that you weren't the first family they did this to, and you sure as hell aren't going to be the last one they get away with it on. What's happening, Ellie, is that word doesn't just travel fast in this county. It travels fast on the interstate too, and there's a lot of interstate between here and where I am right now. Ellie didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. 2 hours, Hawk said again. Hold the line. The call ended, and Ellie sat on the tailgate of her truck, the mud and wreckage of everything she'd built, staring at the crumpled boundary dispute notice in one fist, the envelope of Ashcroft's insulting offer sitting a few feet away where she dropped it, and felt time slow down to something almost unbearable, each minute stretching long and thin, like taffy pulled past its breaking point dot at 3:30. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Jake, a name she hadn't heard from since he'd been loaded into the ambulance 2 weeks earlier. *You holding up okay? Hawk's got everybody moving. You're gonna want to be standing outside when it happens. Trust me. Ellie stared at the message, confusion and unease, and something dangerously close to hope tangling together in her chest. When what happens? She typed back. No response came. At 4 o'clock. Vaughan Ashcroft's black sedan rolled back into the lot, exactly as promised, exactly on schedule, and Ellie felt her whole body go cold at the sight of him stepping out. That same gleaming, patient smile fixed in place, like he already knew how this was going to end. Mrs. Marsh, he said. 1 hour left. I trust you've had time to think. I've had time to learn a great deal. Mr. Ashcroft, Ellie said, forcing steel into her voice, despite the exhaustion threatening to buckle her knees. About boundary disputes filed the same morning your offer expires. About adjustment firms with registered agents who share your company's address. About 3 other families in this county who got the exact same treatment you're giving me right now. Ashcroft's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went very still, very cold. That's a dangerous game to play, Mrs. Marsh. Accusations like that without proof tend to end badly for the person making them. Funny, Ellie said. Somebody else said almost that exact same thing to me yesterday. Small county, I guess. Word travels. For just a moment, one brief, telling moment, Ashcroft's composure cracked, something ugly and impatient flashing across his face before he smoothed it back into that same rehearsed calm. 1 hour, he said, checking an expensive watch. After that, this offer is gone. The bank moves on the property, and you're left with nothing but a lawsuit you can't afford and a story nobody with any actual power is going to believe. Think very carefully, Mrs. Marsh. He turned and walked back toward his car, unhurried, supremely confident, a man who'd clearly run this exact routine enough times to know exactly how it always ended. That was when Ellie heard it. At first she thought it was her own pulse pounding too loud in her ears after a day of accumulated terror, but it kept building, low and steady, a vibration she felt through the soreness of her boots before she consciously registered it as sound. Ashcroft heard it too. He stopped with one hand on his car door, head tilting, brow furrowing in mild irritation. like a man interrupted mid-sentence by something he hadn't planned for. "What in the world?" Ellie whispered, turning toward the highway. The sound kept building. Not thunder, not the scream of a tornado, something else entirely. A deep, rolling roar that grew steadily louder, richer, more layered, until it stopped sounding like a handful of engines and started sounding like something enormous. Something that made the ground itself seem to hum beneath her boots. "What asterisk is asterisk that?" Ashcroft muttered, straightening up, squinting toward the horizon, where the highway curved out of sight behind a stand of storm-battered trees. Ellie's heart began to pound, so hard she could feel it in her throat. She thought, absurdly, impossibly, of the night of the tornado, of standing in this exact spot, listening to a sound that shouldn't have belonged to a storm, and turned out to be 27 motorcycles fighting through hurricane winds toward her shelter. This sound was bigger, immeasurably bigger. The first bikes came around the curve, and then the second wave, and then it stopped being waves at all and simply became a solid, unbroken river of motorcycles pouring down the highway toward the town, chrome flashing in the late afternoon light, engines layering into a single continuous roar that shook loose bits of debris still clinging to the wreckage around them. "That's not possible," Ashcroft said, and for the first time since he'd first pulled into her lot 2 weeks earlier, Ellie heard something crack in his voice. Not confidence, the beginning of real, genuine alarm. Ellie stood frozen, one hand pressed against her chest, watching a wall of motorcycles stretch back further than she could see, further than the curve of the highway allowed her to track. Riders in formation, colors and patches from clubs and chapters she'd never heard of. A river of leather and chrome that kept coming and showed no sign of ending. 27, she whispered, remembering the night in the shelter, remembering counting heads in the dark. This isn't 27. It wasn't 100 either. As the first riders began peeling off the highway into what remained of her lot, engines idling down to a low, steady growl, more kept coming behind them in an endless procession that seemed to have no bottom to it, filling the road as far back as Ellie could see, filling the air with a sound so massive it seemed to press against her ribs. Leading the pack, unmistakable even at a distance, was Hawk. He rode straight and steady at the front of the formation, and as he drew closer, Ellie could see the exhaustion in his face. The road dust caked into the creases of his jacket. A man who had clearly ridden hard and far and fast to be standing here. At this exact moment, he pulled to a stop directly in front of her, killed the engine, and swung off the bike in one smooth, deliberate motion, his eyes finding hers immediately, steady and certain, in a way that made 3 weeks of terror and exhaustion finally start to loosen its grip on her chest. "Told you to hold the line," Hawk said. Ellie couldn't speak. She could only stare past him at the seemingly endless river of motorcycles still pouring off the highway, filling every inch of the lot and spilling into the field beyond, engines cutting off one by one until the roar softened into something almost like a held breath. Hundreds, and then over 1,000 riders, dismounting in near-perfect, disciplined silence. "Hawk," she finally managed. "What is this? What did you do?" "Made some calls," Hawk said simply. Turns out a lot of people wanted to answer. Ashcroft, still frozen by his car door, had gone pale beneath his expensive tan. His earlier confidence entirely evaporated, replaced by something that looked, for the first time, like genuine fear. This is a public road," he stammered, finding his voice, though it carried none of its earlier polish. "This is harassment. I'll have every one of you arrested for trespassing, for intimidation. This is a woman's private property," Hawk said, turning toward him slowly, his voice carrying easily across the sudden, heavy quiet that had fallen over the lot. "And every man and woman standing here has been personally invited by the owner. Isn't that right, Ellie?" Ellie looked at Ashcroft, at the fear finally cracking through his practiced composure, and felt something rise in her chest that wasn't quite triumph, not yet, but undeniably, powerfully close to it. "That's right," she said, her voice steady now. stronger than it had been in weeks. Every one of them. Ashcroft started, then stopped, visibly recalculating, his eyes darting across the impossible sea of leather and chrome surrounding his sedan on every side. This doesn't change anything. The bank still forecloses. The insurance determination still stands. You can bring 1,000 bikers here, Mrs. Marsh, and it won't change a single piece of paperwork. 1,680, Hawke said quietly. Ashcroft blinked. What? 1,680 riders, Hawke repeated, and something in his voice had gone razor-sharp, precise. A man laying a card on the table he'd been holding for exactly the right moment. From 41 chapters, across 9 states. Some of them drove 12 hours straight to be standing here right now. You want to know why, Mr. Ashcroft? Ashcroft didn't answer. He looked, for the first time, like a man who understood he was standing in water far over his head, because while you and your friend Pratt were busy squeezing this woman for every last cent you could steal from her, Hawke continued, voice carrying easily across the silent crowd. Some of my brothers, who happen to have a background in forensic accounting, were busy pulling every single filing connected to Ashcroft land holdings for the last 5 years. And what they found, Mr. Ashcroft, is a very interesting pattern, he nodded. And a rider near the front of the crowd, grey-haired, sharp-eyed, a vest reading SGT at arms beneath a patch Ellie didn't recognize, stepped forward, holding a thick folder. Denise Alvarez, the woman said, extending a hand toward a figure Ellie hadn't even noticed step out of the crowd. The same reporter, Ellie realized with a jolt, who had called her that morning asking about bikers. County Gazette. I got an interesting tip a few hours ago about a pattern of storm-damaged properties being systematically undervalued by a specific adjustment firm, then bought up cheap by a holding company with some very curious ties to that same firm. Ashcroft's face had gone from pale to something closer to grey. This, you can't. This is defamation. It's public record, actually, the reporter said, flipping open her own notepad. 3 other families in this county, all with strikingly similar stories to Mrs. Marsh's. Would you like to comment on the record, Mr. Ashcroft? Or should I just print what I already have? Ashcroft's mouth opened and closed twice, no sound coming out, and Ellie watched the last of his composure crumble entirely as he looked around at the sea of faces surrounding him, 1,000 riders, a reporter with a notepad, and Ellie Marsh standing squarely between him and his car, no longer the desperate, cornered widow he'd spent a week so carefully, methodically preying upon. I don't have to stand here for this, Ashcroft finally managed, yanking his car door open. No, Hawke agreed evenly. You don't, but you should know before you go that copies of everything we found, every filing, every matching address, every denied claim that lines up a little too perfectly with one of your purchase offers, those are already sitting on the desk of the State Insurance Commissioner's office as of about 2 hours ago, along with the county DAR, along with, as it happens, a couple of reporters at outlets a good deal bigger than the Gazette. Ashcroft froze, half in his car, one hand white-knuckled on the door frame. That's not, you can't, we can, and we did, Hawke said. Turns out a club with 41 chapters has a lot of resources when it decides to use them on behalf of somebody who earned it. You've got a long few months coming, Mr. Ashcroft. I'd start with a good lawyer, and I'd start soon. Ashcroft didn't say another word. He dropped into his sedan, slammed the door hard enough that the sound cracked across the silent lot like a gunshot, and reversed out through a corridor of parted motorcycles that closed silently, deliberately behind him as he fled down the highway, tires spitting gravel, taillights shrinking fast into the distance. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Ellie stood in the middle of her ruined lot, surrounded by more motorcycles than she had ever imagined existed in one place, and felt the full, staggering weight of what had just happened finally crashed down over her all at once. Her knees buckled. Hawke caught her before she hit the ground, one strong arm around her shoulders, steadying her the same way he had at the hatch 3 weeks earlier. The same way. She realized now. He'd been steadying her in every possible sense ever since. "I've got you," he said quietly. "You held the line. It's over." "It's not over," Ellie said, her voice shaking, tears finally breaking free after weeks of holding them back. "The bank, the foreclosure. I still don't have anywhere to." "Ellie." Hawk's voice was gentle, but absolutely certain, cutting cleanly through her spiraling panic. "Look around you." Ellie lifted her head, wiping at her eyes, and looked, really looked, at the sea of faces surrounding her. Weathered, tattooed, rain-scarred men and women who had ridden hundreds of miles on nothing but a phone call and a story about a widow who'd opened her door to strangers in a storm. "There's not a foreclosure notice in this county that survives what happens next," Hawk said. "There's not a bank that forecloses on a property when 41 chapters and a state investigation are both watching. And there's not an insurance company in the state that wants their name anywhere near what Pratt's about to have coming for him. I don't understand." Ellie whispered. Jake pushed his way through the crowd just then, still favoring his healing leg slightly, a wide, exhausted, delighted grin on his young face. "He means we've got this," Jake said. "All of it. Every single piece of it." Ellie looked from Jake to Hawk to the massive, silent crowd surrounding her. 1,680 riders who had answered a phone call because a woman had once looked at 27 strangers in the middle of a tornado and chosen kindness over fear, and felt something break open in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the debt. She was only now beginning to understand the true size of why. She managed finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Why would all of you come for me?" Hawk was quiet a moment, studying her with an expression that held none of the calculating hardness he'd shown Ashcroft. Only something warm, something certain, something that had been building since the night he'd watched her dig bare-handed through the wreckage of her own life for a single photograph. "You opened your door when everyone else would have closed theirs," Hawk said, loud enough now that the words carried across the entire silent crowd, across 1,680 riders who had come from 9 states to hear him say it. "You saved our brothers. Now we're here to save you." A rumble of agreement rolled through the crowd, low and unified, and somewhere behind her, Ellie heard the reporter's pen scratching fast against her notepad, already writing the story that would, within a week, travel far beyond the borders of the county. "They came together," Hawk continued, turning to address the crowd now as much as Ellie, his voice carrying the weight of a promise he'd clearly been building toward since the moment he first pulled that scrap of paper from his vest 3 weeks earlier. Because chapters across this entire country heard what one woman did for 27 strangers, and every single one of them understood something simple. A debt like that isn't measured in money, it's measured in showing up. And we showed up. Ellie looked out over the crowd, over the motorcycles filling every inch of her ruined lot and spilling into the field beyond, over faces she'd never seen before that had traveled hundreds of miles for her, over Jake's grin and the reporter's notepad and Hawk's steady, unwavering presence beside her, and felt for the first time since the sirens had screamed through her town 3 weeks earlier. Something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with hope. "I don't know how to thank 1,680 people," she said, her voice thick with tears. She no longer tried to hold back. "You already did," Hawk said quietly. 3 weeks ago, in a storm, when you opened a door nobody would have blamed you for closing. The sun was beginning to sink low toward the flattened horizon, painting the endless sea of motorcycles in long streaks of gold and amber. The crowd didn't disperse as it dropped. If anything, it settled deeper into the lot, riders finding places to stand or sit on overturned crates and the hoods of their bikes. A strange and improbable stillness falling over 1,680 people who had ridden hundreds of miles, and now seemed content simply to be present, to bear witness to whatever came next. Hawk reached into the saddlebag of his motorcycle and pulled out a thick envelope, considerably heavier than the one Ashcroft had left sitting on Ellie's truck the day before. He held it out to her with both hands, The way a man hands over something he considers sacred. Before you say anything, he said, I need you to understand what this is and what it isn't. Ellie stared at the envelope, hands trembling as she took it, unable to make herself open it yet. Hawk, I already told you. I don't need. It's not charity, Hawk said, cutting her off gently but firmly. The same words he'd used 3 weeks earlier, said now with even more weight behind them. 41 chapters past a hat. Every single rider standing in this lot right now put something into that envelope before we ever left our own towns. This isn't me deciding to help you, Ellie. This is 1,680 people deciding together that a debt gets paid. Ellie opened the flap with shaking fingers and felt her breath catch entirely at what she found inside. Not just cash, though there was more of it than she'd seen in one place in her entire life, but also a cashier's check, folded neatly on top, made out directly to her. Hawk, she whispered, this is enough to clear the loan. This is enough to clear the loan and rebuild both buildings and still have money left over. That's the idea, Hawk said simply. I can't accept this. You already did, Jake said, grinning from where he stood a few feet away, still favoring his leg, but steadier now than he'd been 3 weeks earlier. It's already in your hands. Ellie looked around at the crowd, at faces weathered by road and wind and years of being misjudged by people who never bothered to look past the leather, and felt something crack open in her chest that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a gratitude too enormous to hold inside her body. I don't know what to say, she finally managed. Don't say anything yet, Hawk said, because that's not all of it. He turned and gestured toward the back of the massive formation of motorcycles, and Ellie watched as the crowd parted to reveal a line of flatbed trucks she hadn't even noticed arrive, stacked high with lumber, steel roofing panels, pallets of concrete mix, coils of wiring, everything a person would need to raise a building from nothing. We didn't just bring money, Hawk said. We brought hands. A man stepped forward from near the trucks, broad-shouldered, grey-bearded, a tall belt already slung over one shoulder, like he'd been waiting all day for permission to put it on. Name's Deacon, he said, extending a hand to Ellie. 20 years a union electrician before I retired. Got about a dozen more like me back there. Carpenters, a couple plumbers, a fellow who used to run his own concrete company down in Texas. We figured you might need the help. Behind him, more riders began stepping forward, introducing themselves one by one, and Ellie realized with a dawning, overwhelming clarity that this wasn't simply a gesture of gratitude. This was an army of skilled hands, tradesmen and craftsmen who had spent their lives building things, all of them here, all of them ready to work. This is too much, Ellie said, her voice breaking. All of this, it's too much, ma'am, Deacon said, not unkindly, with respect. I don't think you understand what you did for us. You think a tornado's the only storm we've ever ridden through. Half these men have been in real storms, bad ones, the kind that leave people broken and alone with nobody willing to help because of a patch and a vest. You didn't see a patch. You saw people who needed help. Don't you dare tell us this is too much. Ellie wiped at her eyes, unable to argue with that, unable to argue with any of it, and simply nodded, clutching the envelope to her chest the way she'd clutched Tom's photograph in the wreckage 3 weeks earlier. Okay, she said. Okay. Where do we start? That question set into motion a transformation Ellie could never have imagined possible. They started the next morning before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. Ellie woke to the sound of engines and hammers. Dozens of riders already at work clearing the last of the debris, sorting salvageable materials from ruin, laying out string lines across the foundation where the shop had once stood. She stumbled out of the shelter, rubbing sleep from her eyes, to find Hawk already directing traffic like a foreman who'd run job sites his entire life, which, she would learn over the coming days, he actually had, decades earlier, before the road had claimed him entirely. You didn't have to start this early, she said, handing him a cup of the same weak instant coffee she'd been surviving on 4 weeks. Storm season doesn't wait for people to catch up on sleep, Hawk said, taking the cup with a small, tired smile. Figured we shouldn't either. Word spread through town faster, even, than it had spread about the tornado itself. By mid-morning, townspeople had begun gathering at the edge of the property, drawn by the impossible sight of over 1,000 motorcycles parked across the marshland, and dozens of leather-clad bikers hammering, sawing, hauling lumber with the kind of practiced efficiency that put most construction crews to shame. Ellie noticed the way people watched from a careful distance. At first, the same weary uncertainty she'd felt herself the night of the storm. Whispered conversations behind cupped hands. A few outright stares carrying more judgment than curiosity. One woman, an older neighbor Ellie recognized from church, though they'd never spoken much, finally approached around noon, arms crossed tight over her chest. "Ellie, honey, are you safe out here with all these people?" the woman asked, voice pitched low like she didn't want to be overheard, eyes flicking nervously toward a cluster of tattooed riders unloading lumber 20 feet away. Ellie set down the tool belt she'd borrowed and looked the woman steadily in the eye. "Mrs. Dawson, these men carried 3 injured brothers through a tornado to get to my shelter. They've spent the last 3 weeks fighting a corrupt insurance adjuster and a predatory land developer on my behalf without me even asking them to. And right now, they're rebuilding my home with their own hands and their own money, free of charge. I have never in my life felt safer than I do standing in this lot with them." Mrs. Dawson's mouth opened, then closed, clearly unprepared for the force of Ellie's answer. "I just worrying," she started again. "Softer now, I know," Ellie said, her voice gentle too. Understanding the fear wasn't malicious, just old, just inherited from a lifetime of headlines and warnings that had never once bothered to ask the actual people wearing the patches what they were really like. "But you're welcome to stay and watch. Maybe you'll see something different than what you expected." Mrs. Dawson hesitated. Then, to Ellie's quiet surprise, pulled a folding chair from the back of her car and set it up at the edge of the lot, watching the work unfold through the rest of the afternoon in careful, thoughtful silence. She wasn't the only one. By the second day, a small crowd of townspeople had gathered regularly along the fence line, some out of curiosity, some out of genuine concern for Ellie, most simply unable to look away from the strange, powerful sight of over 1,000 bikers laboring from sunrise to sunset to rebuild a stranger's life. The framing for the new shop went up in 4 days flat, faster than Ellie could have imagined possible. Even with a full professional crew and an unlimited budget, Deacon ran the electrical work with military precision, barking good-natured orders at a rotating crew of volunteers who seemed to genuinely enjoy being barked at. A woman named Sadie, one of the few female riders in the massive convoy, turned out to be a licensed contractor back in Missouri and took over general oversight of the build with an authority that made even the most weathered old bikers fall into line without complaint. Ellie found herself constantly moving between roles, handing out tools, fetching water, answering questions about where things had originally stood so the rebuild could honor the shop's original layout, and increasingly, simply talking, really talking, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to in the 3 long years since Tom's death. She told Jake about the day Tom proposed, right there in the old bay. Grease on both their hands, number ring, because he'd spent his last dollar on a transmission part for a customer who couldn't afford to tow their car anywhere else. She told Deacon about the winter Tom had rebuilt the shop's ancient furnace from spare parts because they couldn't afford a new one, working through Christmas Eve so the pipes wouldn't freeze. She told Sadie, quietly, one evening while they were framing the last wall of the apartment upstairs, about the morning she'd found Tom on the kitchen floor, about the 3 days she'd spent afterward unable to make herself walk back into their bedroom. "You don't have to keep pushing through this alone anymore," Sadie said simply, driving her now with 3 efficient strikes of her hammer. "That's kind of the whole point of all this." It was on the 5th day that the twist came. Ellie was up on a ladder helping hang new drywall, in what would become the shop's front office when Hawk's phone rang, and she watched from her perch as his expression shifted from casual to sharply focused in the span of a single sentence. "Say that again," he said into the phone, voice tight. "Slow down." The hammering around them slowed, then stopped entirely. Riders sensing the shift in Hawk's posture, the way soldiers sense a change in weather. Ellie climbed down the ladder, heart already hammering, half convinced Ashcroft had found some new way to strike. "What is it?" she asked when Hawk finally lowered the phone. That was Denise, the reporter. Hawk's jaw was tight, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. The story ran this morning. Front page, State edition, not just the county paper. "Okay," Ellie said slowly. "Is that bad?" "It's not bad," Hawk said. "It's about to get very complicated, very fast." He was right. Within the hour, Ellie's phone, the same phone that had barely rung in 3 years, except for bill collectors and the occasional customer, began buzzing constantly. Numbers she didn't recognize, voicemails piling up faster than she could listen to them. A local news van pulled up to the edge of the property by early afternoon. A reporter and cameraman climbing out with the eager energy of people who smelled a story bigger than a simple storm recovery piece. "Mrs. Marsh, can we get a statement about the allegations against Ashcroft Land Holdings?" the reporter called out, microphone already extended as Ellie approached the fence line reluctantly, Hawk a steady presence at her shoulder. "I don't have anything prepared," Ellie said, startled by the sudden attention. "Is it true that over 1,600 motorcyclists showed up to stop a fraudulent land grab?" the reporter pressed. "Can you confirm the Insurance Commissioner's office has opened a formal investigation into adjuster Roland Pratt?" Ellie glanced at Hawk, uncertain, and he gave her a small, steady nod, the same silent confidence he'd offered her the night of the tornado when she'd hesitated at the door. "Everything in that article is true," Ellie said, turning back to the camera, her voice finding steadiness she didn't know she still had. "I lost my home and my family's business in the storm, and instead of helping me rebuild, the people who were supposed to help, my insurance adjuster, a land developer circling my property, they tried to take advantage of a woman who just lost everything. And when I had nowhere else to turn, the same men I sheltered during that tornado came back and stood beside me. That's the whole story. That's all any of this ever was." The reporter pressed for more, but Hawk stepped in smoothly, polite but immovable, redirecting the crew towards statements from Deacon and Sadie about the rebuild itself, buying Ellie space to step back, hands shaking, overwhelmed by a spotlight she'd never once asked for. That evening, sitting on an overturned crate near the newly framed shop, exhaustion finally catching up with her, Ellie turned to Hawk with a question that had been building in her chest all day. "Is this going to cause trouble for you, for the club, all this attention?" Hawk considered the question for a long moment, watching the last riders wrapping up the day's work in the fading light. "Ellie, you need to understand something about people like Ashcroft and Pratt," he said. "Men like that survive by operating where nobody's looking. The moment a light gets shined on what they're doing, most of the fear they rely on just evaporates. This story running isn't trouble for us. It's the opposite. It means people like Ashcroft can't do this to the next family, the next widow, without somebody remembering what happened here. Doesn't this kind of attention usually work against you? People already assume the worst about bikers. Some will keep assuming the worst no matter what we do," Hawk said. "That's never going to change completely, and I stopped losing sleep over that a long time ago. But every person who reads that article and sees 1,680 of us rebuilding a stranger's house instead of tearing something down, that's one more person who might actually stop and think twice before judging the next patch they see coming down the highway." Ellie was quiet a moment, watching the darkening sky, the first stars beginning to prick through above the skeleton of her half-finished new home. "Mrs. Dawson brought a casserole today," she finally said, a small, disbelieving laugh escaping her. "The woman who asked me 3 days ago if I was safe out here. She brought a casserole and sat with Sadie for 2 hours talking about quilting patterns." Hawk laughed, low and warm, a sound Ellie was beginning to realize she looked forward to hearing. Told you, people just need a reason to look a little closer. The investigation into Pratt and Ashcroft accelerated faster than anyone anticipated. 2 days after the article ran, the State Insurance Commissioner's Office issued a formal statement confirming an active fraud investigation into the adjustment firm, citing a pattern of manipulated, pre-existing condition flags across at least 6 storm-damaged properties in the region. By the end of that same week, county prosecutors had opened a parallel investigation into Ashcroft Land Holdings for suspected collusion in predatory acquisition practices. Pratt was placed on administrative leave, his name and photograph appearing within days in a follow-up article, alongside a growing list of families who had come forward once Ellie's story broke the silence that had kept them each isolated in their own private shame and defeat. I thought it was just me, the elderly woman Ellie had spoken 2 weeks earlier told her over the phone, voice thick with emotion. I thought I was the only one foolish enough to fall for it. I didn't know there were others. I didn't know anybody would ever believe me. You weren't foolish, Ellie told her. You were targeted. There's a difference, and it's not a small one. The woman's claim, along with 2 others, was reopened for full reassessment. Within the month, the artificial pre-existing condition flags were removed once investigators confirmed the pattern Ellie had first noticed staring at case reference numbers by flashlight in the bottom of her storm shelter. Ashcroft Land Holdings' business license was suspended pending investigation. Vaughan Ashcroft himself, according to Denise's increasingly detailed follow-up reporting, had reportedly retained a defense attorney out of Oklahoma City and had not been seen publicly in the county since the day 1,680 motorcycles rolled down the highway and closed a corridor around his car. Ellie, read every article twice, sitting on the newly poured front steps of a rebuilt shop in the evenings, feeling something settle inside her. She could only describe as justice, not loud, not triumphant, just quiet and solid and real. The simple, steady satisfaction of watching a wrong finally properly answered. The bank, for its part, moved with unusual speed once the cashier's check cleared. The foreclosure notice formally withdrawn within 72 hours. The branch manager, who had once delivered cold, clipped warnings over the phone, calling personally to apologize for what he called an unfortunate misunderstanding regarding timeline flexibility. Funny how flexible timelines get once somebody's paying attention, Ellie said dryly to Hawk after that call, and he laughed, shaking his head. Welcome to how the world actually works, he said. Money and attention, 2 things people like Ashcroft count on regular folks never having enough of. The rebuild continued through the following 2 weeks at a pace that still, even watching it unfold day by day, struck Ellie as something close to miraculous. The shop's new bay doors went up electric-powered this time, courtesy of Deacon's insistence that no widow should ever have to crank a door by hand again if I've got anything to say about it. The apartment above was reframed, larger than the original, an extra window added at Sadie's suggestion to let more morning light into what would become Ellie's new bedroom. It was during the reconstruction of that upstairs space that Ellie found herself alone with Hawk for the first time in days, the rest of the crew having broken for a late lunch, the 2 of them finishing the trim work around the new window in a comfortable, companionable quiet that had grown between them over the past weeks without either of them quite noticing when it started. Can I ask you something? Ellie said, running a hand along the fresh wood of the window frame. Always. Why you? Out of everybody in that shelter that night, why were you the one who kept coming back? The phone calls, the promise, all of this. She gestured around the half-finished room. You didn't have to be the one carrying all this. Hawk set down his tools, considering the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything. 20 years ago, he said slowly, I was the one drowning. Wife left, took my daughter with her. Told the courts I wasn't fit because of the patch on my back. Never mind, I'd never so much as raised my voice at either of them. Lost my job not long after. some corporate restructuring that conveniently happened to target the guy with tattoos on his knuckles. I was about as low as a man gets, ready to give up on all of it. Ellie stayed quiet, sensing there was more, letting him find it in his own time. A woman gave me a job when nobody else would. Hawk continued. Ran a diner outside Tulsa. Didn't care what I looked like, just cared that I showed up on time and worked hard. Never told me why she did it. Never asked for anything back. 3 years later, her place caught fire. Insurance wouldn't cover half of what she lost. Same kind of story. Who'd been living the last month. I organized 11 guys back then. 11. Rebuilt her diner in 2 weeks. He paused. That's when I understood what the patch on my back was actually supposed to mean. Not the outlaw stuff people assume. The brotherhood. The idea that when somebody shows you kindness with nothing to gain from it, you don't let that debt sit unanswered. So this, Ellie said quietly, is you paying forward what she gave you. This is me recognizing the same kind of person, Hawk said, his eyes finding her steadily in the afternoon light, slanting through the new window. You didn't open that shelter because you thought you'd get something out of it. Ellie, you did it because it was right there in front of you, and you couldn't live with yourself if you didn't. That's rare. That's worth protecting. Something passed between them in that quiet, unfinished room, something neither of them named out loud, but that Ellie carried with her for the rest of the afternoon, warm and unfamiliar, in a chest that had spent 3 years carefully guarded against exactly this kind of feeling. The final push toward completion came together in a single extraordinary week. Riders who had gone home to their own families in the days after the initial standoff with Ashcroft began trickling back as word spread of the rebuild's progress. Some driving hundreds of miles simply to spend a weekend hammering shingles or hauling drywall before heading home again. The shop's new sign frame went up on a Thursday. Though the sign itself remained blank, waiting, Hawk explained mysteriously. For Ellie to decide what it should say, it's always said Marge's Garage, Ellie said, staring up at the empty frame. I don't know why it would say anything different now. You don't have to decide today, Hawk said. But this place isn't quite the same as it was before the storm hit it. Ellie considered that, looking around at the transformed lot. The rebuilt shop standing stronger and better equipped than the original had ever been. The community of townspeople who now gathered regularly along the fence line, not out of wary curiosity, but genuine warmth. The small folding table Mrs. Dawson had taken to setting up most afternoons with lemonade for the crew. The friendships that had formed in a matter of weeks between people who 3 months earlier would have crossed the street rather than acknowledge each other's existence. No, she admitted, it's not the same at all. The community center edition, an idea first floated almost as a joke by Sadie during a lunch break, took shape faster than anyone expected once the momentum caught. A separate structure adjacent to the shop, built from the same reclaimed and new materials, designed to serve as exactly what the town had desperately needed since the storm first tore through. A place for displaced families to gather, receive donated supplies, connect with resources the county's overwhelmed emergency services couldn't always provide fast enough. Mrs. Dawson, of all people, became one of its most enthusiastic organizers, coordinating a donation drive among the same neighbors who had once eyed the bikers with suspicion, now working alongside them to stock shelves with canned goods and blankets and children's clothing for families still recovering from the tornado's wider damage across the county. Never thought I'd see the day, Mrs. Dawson admitted to Ellie one afternoon, watching two heavily tattooed riders carefully organizing donated toys by age group with the gentle precision of men who clearly had grandchildren of their own waiting back home. Guess I had some things wrong about people. Most folks do, Ellie said, until something forces them to look closer. The transformation wasn't just physical. Ellie watched it happen in the eyes of people across town, the slow, steady erosion of assumptions that had stood unquestioned for years, replaced by something more honest, more complicated, more true. Sheriff Doyle, who had eyed the crowd with such weariness the morning after the tornado, now stopped by regularly, sometimes bringing coffee for the crew, once staying nearly 2 hours trading old motorcycle stories with Deacon that left both men laughing so hard Ellie could hear it clear across the lot. It wasn't that the town had simply decided to like the Iron Sons. Ellie understood. It was something deeper than that. Something that mattered more. They had simply stopped assuming they already knew who these men were before actually meeting them. 3 weeks after the article first broke, on a bright, clear afternoon that felt almost deliberately chosen by whatever force governed such things, Ellie stood in the finished bay of her rebuilt shop, running her hand along a workbench Deacon had built to match almost exactly the one Tom had built with his own hands over a decade earlier. "It's not the same shop," she said quietly to Hawk, who had come to stand beside her. "No," he agreed. "It's better wired, better insulated, and it's got a door that opens on a switch, head of a hand crank, that'll throw your back out one of these days." Ellie laughed, wiping at unexpected tears. "That's not what I meant. I know," Hawk said gently, "but I think Tom would understand what it means either way. A place built by people who cared enough to show up. Standing on the same ground his family worked for 3 generations. That's not a replacement, Ellie. That's a continuation." Ellie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and looked out through the open bay door at the lot beyond. No longer a wasteland of splintered lumber and twisted metal, but something whole again, something rebuilt, not just in wood and steel, but in the fabric of an entire community that had been quietly, permanently changed by one decision made in the middle of a storm. Above the door, the sign frame still waited, blank, patient, ready for whatever name Ellie finally chose to give this new chapter of a story that had started with a tornado and somehow, impossibly, become something far larger than either destruction or grief had any right to allow. The weeks that followed the shop's completion moved with a strange, gentle rhythm Ellie hadn't felt in years. Not the frantic survival mode of the storm's aftermath, not the constant vigilance of fighting Ashcroft and Pratt, but something closer to peace, if peace was even the right word for a life that still felt so unfamiliar in its fullness. She was elbow deep in a transmission one Tuesday morning, customers trickling back now that word had spread, when her phone buzzed with a call from a number she'd started to dread on instinct alone, the county courthouse. "Mrs. Marsh, this is the clerk's office. I wanted to give you advance notice. The Ashcroft Holdings case has been scheduled for a preliminary hearing next month. Given your involvement, the DA's office would like to discuss your willingness to testify." Ellie wiped grease from her hands, heart picking up its old familiar anxious rhythm. Testify against Ashcroft, and potentially Mr. Pratt as well, given the connected nature of the charges. "I know this might feel like reopening old wounds, but your testimony could be significant." Ellie was quiet a long moment, staring out through the open bay door at the lot where, just weeks earlier, 1,680 motorcycles had filled every inch of gravel and grass in an act of loyalty she still sometimes had trouble believing had actually happened. "I'll do it," she said finally. "Whatever it takes to make sure he can't do this to anybody else." She hung up and found Hawk leaning in the doorway, having clearly caught the tail end of the conversation, his expression carrying the particular stillness he wore whenever something serious was unfolding. "They want you in court," he said. It wasn't a question. "Next month. Preliminary hearing." Ellie set down her wrench, suddenly aware of how much her hands were shaking. "Hawk, what if it doesn't work? What if he gets some slick lawyer and slides right out of this the same way men like him always seem to?" Hawk crossed the bay and took both her hands in his, steadying them the same way he'd steadied her that first night at the hatch, in the middle of a storm that felt now like it had happened to 2 entirely different people. "Then you'll have done everything in your power to stop him," he said. "And that matters, whatever happens after. But Hawk, men like Ashcroft don't usually survive this kind of daylight." Denise's follow-up piece ran in 3 additional papers this week. The insurance commissioner's office has 2 more former employees of Pratt's firm cooperating with investigators. This isn't a small fire anymore. It's a wildfire, and it's not going out. Ellie exhaled slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders, though not all of it. "I just want it to be over. I want to stop thinking about him every time my phone rings. It will be, Hawk said, soon. I promise you that. That promise was tested 2 days later, in a way Ellie hadn't anticipated. She was closing up the shop for the evening when a car she didn't recognize pulled into the lot. Not Ashcroft's sleek black sedan, but an older, more modest vehicle. And the man who stepped out of it moved with none of Ashcroft's practiced confidence. He looked, if anything, exhausted, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting nervously toward the shop before he seemed to force himself forward. "Mrs. Marsh," he called out. "My name is Alan Pratt. Roland's my brother." Ellie's whole body went rigid. Behind her, she heard Hawk's footsteps slow, felt him move a half-step closer, present but not intervening, letting her decide how to handle this. "I don't have anything to say to your brother's family," Ellie said, voice tight. "I'm not here for him," Alan said quickly, hands raised slightly, a gesture of surrender rather than threat. "I'm here because I worked for that same firm for 6 years. Mrs. Marsh, I quit 2 months before the storm hit. I've been trying to get someone to listen to what was happening there for over a year before that. Nobody believed me. Nobody wanted to touch it." Ellie glanced at Hawk, uncertain, and he gave her the same small, steady nod he always did, trusting her judgment even in moments that clearly put every protective instinct in his body on alert. "What do you want, Mr. Pratt?" Ellie asked. "I want to testify," Alan said, his voice cracking slightly. "I have records, emails, internal memos going back years, showing exactly how this scheme worked, how many families they targeted, how deliberately it was built. I was too scared to come forward before. I watched what happened here, what you did, and he stopped, swallowing hard. I figured if a woman who lost everything could stand up to all of this, I didn't have much of an excuse left." Ellie felt something complicated move through her chest. Not quite forgiveness, not for Roland, not yet, maybe not ever, but something adjacent to hope, the recognition that even inside the machinery that had tried to destroy her, there were people capable of choosing differently when finally given a reason to. "Talk to the DAS office," Ellie said. "Tell them everything." She paused. "And Mr. Pratt, thank you for finally choosing to." Alan nodded, visibly relieved, and left as quickly as he'd arrived. Ellie stood in the settling dust of his departure, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath the entire case, feeling the weight of what was coming for Ashcroft and Roland Pratt grow immeasurably heavier. "That's not a small thing," Hawk said quietly beside her. "An insider with documentation. That's the kind of testimony that ends careers, ends freedom, depending on what those records show." "Good," Ellie said, and was surprised by how little hesitation lived in the word. The preliminary hearing arrived faster than Ellie felt ready for. A grey Tuesday morning in a courthouse 2 counties over. The kind of sterile, fluorescent lit room that made every emotion feel simultaneously too large and too small for the space. Ellie sat in the gallery beside Hawk, hands twisted together in her lap, watching Vaughan Ashcroft enter through a side door flanked by 2 lawyers in suits that probably cost more than her old shop's entire annual insurance. Premium. He looked different than she remembered. Smaller somehow, stripped of the sleek confidence he'd worn like armor every time he'd pulled into her lot. His eyes swept the gallery once, found Ellie's, and something flickered across his face that might have been anger, might have been fear, might have simply been the recognition of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time, that the world he'd built his entire scheme upon had finally, irreversibly cracked. Roland Pratt entered separately a few minutes later, alone, no lawyer yet visible beside him, his posture carrying the particular defeat of a man who understood exactly how much trouble he was in. The hearing itself moved with the slow, methodical grind Ellie had expected, but still found excruciating to sit through. Motions, procedural arguments, the dollying out the preliminary case with a folder of evidence that had grown. Ellie learned with quiet satisfaction to include not just her own testimony and financial records, but Alan Pratt's internal documentation. matching filings from 3 other victimized families, and forensic accounting reports, connecting Ashcroft Land Holdings acquisitions directly to Pratt's manipulated claims with a precision that left even Ashcroft's lawyers visibly recalculating their strategy. In real time, when Ellie was finally called to testify, her legs felt unsteady beneath her as she rose, but Hawk's hand brushed her shoulder briefly as she passed, and she carried that steadiness with her all the way to the witness stand. "Mrs. Marsh," the DA began, "can you describe for the court what happened on the night of the tornado, and in the weeks that followed?" Ellie told it plainly, without embellishment, the same way she'd have described a repair job to a customer: the storm, the shelter, the 27 strangers, the devastation she'd found waiting for her when she'd finally climbed back into daylight. She described Pratt's visit, the pre-existing condition flag, Ashcroft's offer arriving with suspiciously specific knowledge of her financial situation, the boundary dispute filed the exact morning his deadline expired, and what happened next. "Mrs. Marsh," the DA asked. Ellie glanced just briefly toward the gallery, toward Hawk sitting with his hands folded, watching her with quiet, unwavering pride. 1,680 people showed up, she said simply. People who'd never met me before the night of that storm. People this whole country's been taught to fear and judge without ever actually meeting them. They didn't just stand beside me. They found the truth Mr. Ashcroft and Mr. Pratt had spent years hiding, and they made sure it couldn't be buried anymore. Ashcroft's lawyer objected to the characterization, and the judge sustained it. But Ellie saw the damage had already been done, saw jurors, because it had by then escalated to a full jury proceeding, exchange a look that told her everything she needed to know about which side of this story they believed. The cross-examination was brutal in its own quiet way. Ashcroft's lawyer trying repeatedly to paint Ellie as an unreliable narrator, a grieving widow who had misunderstood ordinary business practices, who had been manipulated by outside parties with her own agenda. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Marsh," the lawyer pressed, "that you had significant financial motivation to construct this narrative, that accusing my client of fraud was considerably more profitable than simply accepting a fair market offer?" Ellie felt anger rise sharp and clean in her chest, and for once, she let it show. Let her voice carry the full weight of 3 weeks spent fighting alone before anyone had come to stand beside her. "I didn't construct anything," she said, meeting the lawyer's gaze directly. "I found matching business addresses in public county records. I found a pattern across for families who'd never spoken to each other before I started asking questions. I didn't need to construct a narrative, sir. Your client and Mr. Pratt already wrote it themselves. I just finally read it." A murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel, and the lawyer, visibly rattled, retreated to a different line of questioning that gained no further traction. By the time Ellie stepped down from the stand, she felt something settle inside her that she hadn't fully realized had still been unresolved. Not just the fear of losing the case, but the deeper fear that had haunted her since the tornado first tore through town. The fear that speaking her own truth plainly and without apology simply wouldn't be enough against people with more money and more power than she'd ever have. It was enough. She could feel it in the room, in the shifted expressions of the jury, in Ashcroft's lawyers huddling in an increasingly urgent conference as the proceedings continued, the hearing recessed for the day, with the judge scheduling formal trial proceedings for the following month. But Denise's follow-up article the next morning carried a headline that told Ellie everything she needed to know about which direction the wind had truly turned. Witness testimony deals major blow to Ashcroft Holdings defense. 3 weeks later, before the formal trial ever needed to convene, Von Ashcroft's lawyers negotiated a plea agreement, restitution to all identified victims, forfeiture of Ashcroft Land Holdings business license permanently, and a prison sentence of 18 months for fraud and racketeering. That Ellie, sitting in the gallery for the final proceeding, found herself watching with a strange, quiet stillness rather than the triumphant satisfaction she'd expected to feel. Roland Pratt's case concluded similarly. though his sentence carried an additional charge related to insurance fraud. His professional license permanently revoked. His name added to a state registry that would follow him for the rest of his working life. "Doesn't feel like I thought it would," Ellie admitted to Hawk afterward, sitting on the courthouse steps in the thin autumn sunlight. "Justice rarely does," Hawk said. "It's not supposed to feel like triumph, Ellie. It's supposed to feel like the ground finally holding steady again." Ellie considered that, turning it over in her mind, and found she couldn't disagree. "What about the other families?" she asked. "The restitution, will it actually reach them?" "Already started," Hawk said. Alan Pratt's testimony helped identify 11 additional victims across 3 counties, not just the 4 we already knew about. Restitution funds are being processed through the court now. "It's not going to fix everything for everybody, but it's a start most of them never thought they'd get," Ellie nodded, watching a group of pigeons scatter across the courthouse plaza, feeling something in her chest finally fully unclench. After nearly 2 months of carrying this fight like a stone lodged permanently beneath her ribs. "It's over," she said quietly, testing the words, uncertain if she fully believed them yet. "It's over," Hawk confirmed. "Now we get to build the part that actually matters." The grand reopening was Sadie's idea originally, though it grew far beyond anything she'd initially proposed once word spread through the county, and somehow well beyond it. What started as a small suggestion, "You should throw some kind of celebration when the shop's fully back up and running, give the town a reason to come see what we built," transformed over the following weeks into something considerably larger, fueled by a community that had watched an entire narrative unfold in real time and wanted desperately to be part of its ending. Ellie spent the days leading up to the event in a constant, pleasant blur of preparation, coordinating with Mrs. Dawson on food donations that had somehow multiplied into what looked like enough to feed the entire county twice over, working with Deacon on final touches to the community centre shelving and signage, fielding calls from local news outlets who wanted to cover what Denise had started referring to, with a journalist's fondness for a good headline, as the story that put this town on the map. Jake, fully healed now, his limp entirely gone, except on the coldest mornings, had taken to visiting most weekends, having apparently appointed himself Ellie's unofficial younger brother in the months since the storm. "You nervous?" he asked her the night before the reopening, the 2 of them sitting on the front steps of the finished shop, the community centre glowing warm and welcoming beside it. "A little," Ellie admitted. "It's strange, having people look at this place and see something worth celebrating instead of just tragedy." "It is something worth celebrating," Jake said. "You know that, right? Not just the shop, all of it. What you did, what it turned into." Ellie was quiet a moment, looking out over the lot where 3 months earlier a tornado had reduced everything she'd built to splinters and mud. "I just opened a door," she said softly. "That's all I did, Jake. I just opened a door." Jake shook his head slowly. "That's the thing about doors, though, isn't it? Sometimes opening the right one at the right moment changes everything that comes after. You didn't just save 27 guys that night. You saved this whole town's chance to actually see us. And I think somewhere in there, we ended up saving you right back." Ellie didn't have an answer for that, but she didn't need one. She simply sat with him in the quiet evening, watching the last light fade behind the rebuilt shop, feeling something settled and whole take root in her chest for the first time in longer than she cared to count. The morning of the reopening arrived bright and clear, the kind of crisp autumn day that made even the flattened, storm-scarred edges of the county almost gentle in the golden light. By 9 o'clock, the lot was already filling with townspeople who'd watched the rebuild unfold from a careful distance, now arriving with genuine enthusiasm. Mrs. Dawson directing volunteers at a long table of donated food with the brisk authority of a woman who had clearly found new purpose in the months since the storm. Sheriff Doyle arriving not in his cruiser, but on an old restored motorcycle of his own that drew appreciative whistles from several of the riders who'd begun trickling back in for the occasion. By 10, The crowd had grown large enough that Ellie found herself briefly overwhelmed, stepping back into the cool shade of the shop's new bay to catch her breath. Hands pressed against her chest. "You all right?" Hawk's voice, gentle, found her there a moment later. "Just a lot of people," Ellie admitted. "A lot of feelings I wasn't fully prepared for." Hawk studied her a long moment, something warm and unhurried in his expression. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. None of it. Not today. Not any day going forward. If you don't want to." Something in the way he said it made Ellie's breath catch, made her look up at him fully, searching his face for whatever lay underneath the words. "Hawk," she started, uncertain exactly what she meant to say. "I know," he said quietly, before she could find the words herself. "I know this isn't the moment for it, with half the county waiting outside. But Ellie, I need you to know, these last 3 months, riding out here every chance I got, making calls, organizing chapters, none of that was just about a debt anymore. Somewhere along the way, it stopped being about what you did for us that night and became about who you are. And I don't know exactly what that means yet, or what it's supposed to look like. But I didn't want to keep pretending it wasn't there." Ellie felt her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the crowd outside, nothing to do with nerves about the reopening, everything to do with the steady, careful man standing in front of her, who had ridden through a tornado to save his brothers, and then ridden back 100 times over to save her. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "I have for a while now. I just wasn't sure it was allowed. Wasn't sure it made sense, considering everything. There's no rule book for this," Hawk said, a small, warm smile breaking across his face. "Believe me, I checked." Ellie laughed, surprised, the sound breaking some of the tension gathered in her chest, and for a brief, suspended moment, standing in the shop that had been rebuilt by 1,680 strangers who had become something closer to family, she allowed herself to simply feel it, the warmth, the possibility, the quiet, steady rightness of a connection that had been building since the night a door opened in the middle of a storm. "We should get out there," she finally said, though she made no move to leave. "We should," Hawk agreed. Equally unmoving. It was Jake, poking his head into the bay with a grin that suggested he'd caught at least part of the moment, who finally broke the spell. "Hey, lovebirds, crowd's asking for Ellie. Might want to save the rest of this for later." Ellie flushed deep red, and Hawk laughed outright, and the two of them finally stepped out into the bright, crowded lot together, Ellie's hand finding his, without either of them quite deciding to make it happen, simply because it felt like exactly where it belonged. The crowd outside had grown considerably larger than Ellie had anticipated, not just the town's residents, but riders from a dozen different chapters who'd made the trip, some familiar faces from the original 27, others part of the massive convoy that had rolled down the highway months earlier, all of them mingling easily now with townspeople who had, over the course of a single transformative season, learned to see past the leather and the patches to the people who actually wore them. Denise was there with a photographer, capturing the scene for what she told Ellie would be a final piece, closing out the story that had by that point been picked up by outlets well beyond the state's borders. Mrs. Dawson had somehow recruited half the church choir to provide impromptu music. Somewhere near the community center, Sadie was leading a tour for a family who had lost their own home in the same storm, showing them the shelves stocked with donated supplies. The small children's play area someone had thoughtfully added in a back corner. Hawk climbed onto the shop's front steps as the crowd's attention gradually gathered, Ellie standing just beside him, her hand still tucked in his, feeling the weight of dozens, then hundreds of eyes settling onto them with a warmth that no longer carried any trace of the weariness that had once greeted the club's arrival. "I'm not much for speeches," Hawk began, and a ripple of affectionate laughter moved through the riders who knew him well enough to recognize the understatement. "But I think this moment deserves a few words anyway, so bear with me." He looked out over the crowd, then down at Ellie beside him, and something in his expression softened even further. 3 months ago," he said, 27 of us rode into a tornado. We had no business surviving. We were scared. We were hurt. And we found a stranger standing in the middle of that storm who had every reason in the world to lock her door and let us figure out our own fate. Instead, she opened it." He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "Most people, when they see men who look like us coming down the highway, they see trouble. They see exactly what years of headlines and warnings have taught them to see." Ellie Marsh looked at 27 strangers in the middle of the worst storm this county's seen in a generation, and she saw 27 human beings who needed help. That's it. That's the whole difference. And because of that one decision, made in about 10 seconds, flat in the middle of hurricane winds, every single one of those 27 men is alive today. A murmur of agreement rolled through the riders, several of them nodding, one or two visibly emotional. "When this woman needed us," Hawk said, his voice growing stronger, "when men who thought her tragedy was a business opportunity tried to take everything she had left, we didn't have to think twice about what came next. 1,680 of us rode here, because a debt like that doesn't get repaid with a handshake and a thank you. It gets repaid by showing up, by standing beside somebody until the fight's actually over." He turned fully to face Ellie now, his voice dropping slightly, though it still carried clearly across the silent, listening crowd. "Most people saw 27 bikers and saw trouble," he said. "You saw 27 human beings who needed help. That's why 1,680 people came when you needed us." Ellie felt tears rising, unable to stop them, unwilling even to try. "This town," Hawk continued, turning back toward the crowd, "spent a long time being afraid of people like us. And maybe some of that fear was earned somewhere along the way, by somebody, at some point. I won't pretend our world's perfect, because it isn't. But what happened here these last 3 months? That's not the exception. That's who most of us actually are underneath the leather. And the patches everybody's so quick to judge. We protect people. We show up. And we don't forget kindness, ever. No matter how long it takes us to properly repay it." He gestured toward the new sign frame above the shop's entrance. Still covered by a simple cloth Sadie had rigged that morning for exactly this moment. "Ellie," Hawk said, turning to her, "you've been putting off deciding what this place should be called. I think it's time." Ellie looked up at the covered sign, her heart pounding. 3 months of grief and terror, and unexpected grace crystallizing suddenly into absolute clarity. "Pull it down," she said. Deacon, standing near the sign with a rope in hand, gave it a firm tug, and the cloth fell away to reveal fresh lettering, carefully painted by Sadie's own hand over the past week in secret. ***, the open door garage. The crowd erupted into applause, whistles cutting through the warm autumn air, and Ellie stood beneath the new sign with tears streaming freely down her face, feeling 3 generations of family history honored, not by staying frozen in place, but by growing into something even larger than what had come before. "It represents the moment," Ellie said once the applause finally settled enough for her voice to carry, "when I chose compassion over fear. When men this whole world taught me to be afraid have turned out to be exactly the people I needed most. I lost everything my family built in that storm, but what came after, what all of you built here together, that's not a replacement. It's proof that sometimes the worst night of your life can also be the beginning of the best chapter." She looked out at the crowd, Mrs. Dawson dabbing at her eyes, Sheriff Doyle nodding solemnly, Jake grinning ear to ear, Sadie and Deacon standing shoulder to shoulder with pride. Hundreds of riders and townspeople who had, over the course of one impossible season, dismantled every assumption that had once kept them separate. "Sometimes," Ellie said, her voice growing steadier with each word, "the people society fears the most are the ones who remember kindness the longest. I found that out the hard way, but I wouldn't trade what I learned for anything, not even to have my old life back exactly as it was." Hawk stepped forward then, taking both her hands in his, in front of the entire gathered crowd, and Ellie understood, without needing a single additional word, exactly what he intended to ask her, though he waited, giving her the choice, the same way he'd always given her the choice. Every single step of this journey. Ellie Marsh, he said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. I know this isn't exactly traditional, standing here in front of half the county and every chapter brother who made the trip, but I've never been much for doing things the traditional way, and neither have you. I'm not asking for anything today except permission to keep showing up every day, for as long as you'll have me. Ellie laughed through her tears, squeezing his hands tightly. You've been showing up for 3 months straight. I think that answer's pretty clear. I want to hear you say it anyway, Hawk said, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Yes, Ellie said, loud and clear, bare and absolutely certain. Keep showing up for as long as you want to. The cheer that followed rattled windows clear across the lot, riders whooping and revving engines in celebration. Mrs. Dawson openly weeping into a handkerchief, Jake pumping his fist in the air like his own team had just won a championship. The celebration stretched long into the evening, food and music and easy laughter filling a lot that 3 months earlier had held nothing but wreckage and grief. Ellie moved through the crowd in a warm, grateful daze, accepting congratulations, listening to Deacon tell increasingly exaggerated versions of the rebuild to a rapt audience of teenagers, watching Sadie patiently answer a dozen questions from curious kids about what it was like being one of the few women wedding with such a large chapter. Near sunset, Ellie found a quiet moment away from the crowd, standing at the edge of the lot where the highway curved out of sight. The same stretch of road 27 motorcycles had appeared on in the middle of a storm that had once threatened to take absolutely everything from her. Hawk found her there, as he seemed to always find her exactly when she needed him most, and settled beside her without a word, simply present, simply steady. Do you ever think about it? Ellie asked quietly. That night, what might have happened if I hadn't opened that door? Every single day, Hawk admitted. I think about it every time I look at Jake walking around on a leg that healed clean, because you knew exactly what to do in the dark with nothing but a flashlight and steady hands. I think about it every time one of the brothers who was in that shelter calls just to check in, just to say thank you again. Like once was never going to be enough. I think about what would have happened to me, Ellie said, if you hadn't come back, if nobody had ever answered that scrap of paper you gave me. I keep wondering how much longer I would have lasted, fighting Ashcroft and Pratt completely alone, before I just gave up and signed whatever they put in front of me. You wouldn't have given up, Hawk said, with quiet certainty. I've known you 3 months, Ellie, and if there's one thing I've learned about you, it's that you don't know how to quit. You'd have found another way. Might have taken longer, might have cost you more, but you'd have found it. Ellie considered that, watching the last light fade gold and amber across the flattened, healing landscape stretching out beyond the highway. Maybe, she said, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out. So am I, Hawk said. They stood together in comfortable silence as the celebration continued behind them, music and laughter drifting on the cooling evening air, the community centre glowing warm and welcoming beside a shop that had risen stronger from its own ashes, a sign overhead that would greet every person who pulled into that lot from this day forward with a simple, powerful truth, that sometimes the door you're most afraid to open is exactly the one that saves you. Weeks later, once the excitement of the reopening had settled into the steady, comfortable rhythm of everyday life, Ellie stood behind the counter of the open-door garage on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, ringing up a customer's bill, laughing at something Jake had said from where he now worked part-time as her apprentice, having decided, with Hawk's blessing, that the open road could wait a while longer for a young man determined to learn everything Ellie Marsh had to teach him about engines and second chances alike. Through the front window, she watched the highway stretch out toward the horizon, the same road that had once brought a tornado, and then 27 strangers, and then, eventually, 1,680 more. She thought about her husband, sometimes, still, in quiet moments, thought about what Tom would say if he could see what his family's shop had become, how it had grown into something even larger than either of them had ever imagined it could be. She liked to think he'd understand. She liked to think he'd have opened that same door if their positions had been reversed, because that was simply the kind of man he'd been, and the kind of woman his loss had eventually, unexpectedly, helped her become. The tornado had taken everything Ellie Marsh had built, but it had also revealed something she never could have predicted. Standing in the wreckage that first terrible morning, that sometimes the worst night of a person's life becomes the doorway into everything good that follows. That courage shown to strangers has a way of finding its way back tenfold, and that the people the world teaches us to fear most are often the very ones who remember kindness the longest and repay it the loudest, and never, ever let a debt like that go unanswered. One woman opened a door in the middle of a storm, and in doing so, she proved once and for all that a single act of compassion, however small it might seem in the moment it's given, has the power to change absolutely everything that comes after.